That fake laugh. That fake laugh is too much to take.
No, I'm sure she's...
That fake laugh is so disgusting.
I'm sure she's great. I'm sure she's great.
I'm thinking that you can give me some of the best performances in the
No, you're right, I don't. It's all about performance.
It's about performance. Oh, Amber, I don't regret. I don't regret.
Oh, what else? What else are you doing? Oh, come on. Come on. Lay it on me. What else? What else other things do you want to add?
Can't talk
You
to you
fucking
sound
lying
like
piece of
Bobby
shit. What?
Bear.
Oh,
Like
no,
a
I
kid
want
show.
to know. I want
Get out of your Uber's
I'm
out.
kind of waiting. You go get it.
Yeah, I'll be in.
Wait, is there no other place for you to run in your 1,500 houses to go run? Come on, go be a real married man and go deal with your shit the way that a man does. Go run to the next house. Every man does.
Yeah.
Go. Run away.
This is the real Miss Heard, the one in the audio recordings, not the one you saw in this courtroom. What you didn't hear on a single recording you heard in this case, and there were many played by both parties, is Mr. Depp ever admitting to hitting, punching, or kicking Miss Heard. You didn't hear it. It doesn't exist. It didn't happen. And despite the fact that Mr. Depp and Miss Heard are heard discussing many of the alleged incidents you've heard about at this trial, like Australia and the Bahamas, you never heard Miss Heard accuse Mr. Depp of sexual assault. Unlike Mr. Depp, who you heard admit to and own up to his past mistakes and his struggles, particularly with drugs and alcohol, Miss Heard will not admit that she has ever done anything wrong. But she cannot deny what you heard on those recordings. As much as Miss Heard and her lawyers have tried to make this case about Mr. Depp's language, it is Miss Heard that repeatedly admits to violence. By April and May of 2016, Mr. Depp had reached his limit. His mother was dying. His finances were a mess. And when he showed up late to Miss Heard's 30th birthday party because a meeting with his new business manager, Edward White, had gone late, Miss Heard, of course, was not understanding. She was furious. You heard from Mr. Depp, both in this courtroom and on audio recordings, that Miss Heard punched him that evening. He left with Travis McGivern, and the next morning he learned that someone had left feces on his bed. Miss Heard denies responsibility, but she admitted to the prank to Starling Jenkins. You heard him testify to that effect. For almost a month after that, they didn't see each other. And you heard from Mr. Depp that when his mother died on May 20th, 2016, he resolved to leave Miss Heard. He was done. And when Miss Heard learned that Mr. Depp was done, that she was really losing him, she went on the attack. She filed for divorce before Mr. Depp could. Then, as you heard from Mr. Depp's divorce lawyer, Laura Wasser, Miss Heard sent a letter demanding financial support. And when her demands weren't met, Miss Heard struck a blow against Mr. Depp that was more damaging than any physical blow she had ever landed. When she walked into court 6 years ago today, on May 27th, 2016, to get a domestic violence restraining order against Mr. Depp, she did so in front of paparazzi with a mark on her face. The evidence presented at this trial demonstrates that Miss Heard didn't just want a divorce. She wanted to ruin him. Miss Heard denied alerting TMZ to the TRO filing in this courtroom. But you heard testimony from Morgan Tremaine that TMZ knew to go to the courthouse, knew what side of her face the alleged bruise was on, and that Miss Heard would pause. She would pause for paparazzi, who got the photos that ended up splashed across newspapers and magazines. Miss Heard testified that she did not personally give photographs of her apparent injuries to People magazine. But somehow, these pictures that she took and maintained on her devices ended up on the cover of People magazine 1 month later. In the end, she walked away with $7 million without any tax liabilities which she
Hello?
said she was donating
Hello?
to two charities, the
Hello?
ACLU and the
Hello?
Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. The ACLU, they got less than $1 million from her. And the Children's Hospital, they got $250,000. But that didn't stop Ms. Heard from telling the world that she donated
सही है.
everything. Because remember, she wanted nothing. And she had donated everything.
तूने
The word
follow करा है
donated.
केस पूरा follow करा है
And that didn't stop her from testifying under
ये
the
देख
penalty of
रहा था।
perjury that she had donated
सही
it.
है
लेकिन
अभी-
Her
पूरी
tried
लाइफ
to tell
स्ट्रीम
you
देखो
that pledge,
हाँ हाँ पूरी तो कौन
लोग
देखता
कट बना के डाल देते थे ना
हाईलाइट से देखते हैं
she
सब
claims she
हाईलाइट
hasn't
से
given the money because she was sued. But you've heard on
आगे ये समरी चल
text
रही है आज
evidence that she
वो
had
अपनी
the
समरी
money
देंगे ये
for
अपनी
13
समरी
months
देंगे
prior.
Final-
क्लोजिंग स्टेटमेंट आएगी ना तो
फाइनल रिजल्ट
She had all the money and had month
रिजल्ट तो
after
पता ही है
month
और
after
मुझे
month
पता है
to fulfill her pledge
ट्विटर पे भी
and
बात होती
actually
रहती है ना
donate the
मैं तो
money.
देख करता हूँ
But she
मैं
didn't.
ट्विटर पे देखता नहीं मैं
She
वीडियो में ना
also
कमेंट
told you that
सेक्शन
she
में
never
पढ़ता हूँ क्या चल
fulfilled
रहा
the
है
pledge because Mr. Depp sued her.
सुना?
भाई
for
कमेंट सेक्शन बहुत मस्त होता है मैं
That's
कमेंट सेक्शन
blatant
देखते
lie.
रहता
After the divorce was finalized, when she sought to initiate an arbitration against Mr. Depp for defamation 3 months before the op-ed was even published, and 6 months before Mr. Depp filed this lawsuit. Not only does this contradict Ms. Heard's excuse for not making donations, it contradicts her narrative that she just wants to move on with her life, that she just wants Mr. Depp to leave her alone. Lies. That is Ms. Heard's narrative. Lies upon lies.
मैं तो सोच रहा हूँ डिस्कॉर्ड का लिंक भी शेयर कर दे किसी को आना हो तो डायरेक्ट डिस्कॉर्ड पे हमारे ज्वाइन कर ले
बहुत क्लोज
And actually were all kinds of accusations flying your way when you said all this, and then there was a divorce settlement, you got $7 million. People were saying this is all about the money, but then you did something that twisted that whole argument. What did you do with that money?
$7 million in total
Are you
was
the live stream
donated
pa, yeah?
to, I split it between the ACLU and Children's Hospital of Los Angeles.
ACLU is a human rights organization.
Sorry, ACLU is a prominent organization, nonprofit organization.
Heard in a lie, she tries to cover it up with more lies. So let's talk about the giant lie at the heart of this case. Ms. Heard's claim that Mr. Depp is an abusive monster and that she is a public figure representing domestic abuse. At the start of this case, Mr. Chu and I told you that you were going to hear some disturbing and graphic tales of abuse from Ms. Heard, and they were designed to shock you and overwhelm you, which you have. We told you that this would be a performance, the role of her lifetime, as a heroic
Body
survivor of brutal
देख
abuse.
सुन रहा है तू
When Mr. Depp brought this case for defamation, Ms. Heard went all in. She spun a story of shocking, overwhelming, brutal abuse.
हाँ
She came into this courtroom
उसने बोला
prepared to give the
लाइफ की
performance
बेस्ट
of her
एक्टिंग
life.
ये वाली है जो उसने
She gave
कोर्टरूम में
it.
दी है एम्बर हर्ड ने
Ms. Heard's acting coach, Christina Sexton, testified that Ms. Heard has difficulty crying when she is acting. You saw it. Ms. Heard sobbing without tears, while spinning elaborate, exaggerated, fantastical accounts of abuse and everything going on in her mind almost a decade prior while enduring that abuse. It was a performance. She told you that what she thinks about, she told you what she thinks you need to hear to convict this man as a domestic abuser and a rapist. She wants you to believe that she was abused countless times. Countless times over the entire course of their relationship. But as Mr. Chu and I promised you, the evidence just does not bear that out. Ms. Heard has told you that she has mountains of evidence of abuse, but there are no medical records reflecting she sustained any injuries from the abuse she claims. Ms. Heard had medical professionals at her disposal: Dr. Kipper, Debbie Lloyd, her own nurse, Erin Filati, and yet there's nothing. Ms. Heard took pictures all the time. Pictures of Mr. Depp sleeping.
म्यूट हो गया क्या?
Pictures of
हाँ,
cocaine.
हो गया.
Pictures of property damage. Pictures of herself. And as an actress, she was photographed all the time. Where are the pictures of the horrific injuries Ms. Heard describes? Ms. Heard also took audio recordings and videos frequently. Where are the videos of Mr. Depp attacking her? Where are the audio recordings of Mr. Depp admitting to or apologizing for physical abuse? There are none. What Ms. Heard has, and what you've seen multiple times, is a video of Mr. Depp banging some cabinets around in a kitchen. A video that, based on the testimony you heard from Morgan Tremaine, the former TMZ employee, Ms. Heard seems to have sold to TMZ right before she was deposed in connection with her divorce from Mr. Depp. Sure, Ms. Heard can point to text messages where Mr. Depp is apologizing to her, but never for violence. Ms. Heard's counsel showed you Defendant's Exhibit 325, where Mr. Depp says sorry for, quote, my behavior. I'm a fucking savage.
यहाँ पे भी stream कर रहे हो?
But this is not an apology.
यहाँ पे कहाँ
It's
पे?
an apology for these, quote, these heinous,
नहीं Discord पे
वीडियो
नहीं
नहीं
है.
है वीडियो नहीं आ रहा
Mr. Depp
अरे वो वीडियो
apologizing
वो तब
for
हट
the
जाता है जब
words
मैं
he
फोकस से हटाता हूँ ना YouTube को.
Unlike Ms. Heard,
तो वो वहाँ से
who
वीडियो
you
मिल
heard
जाता है.
apologizing for physical violence in multiple audio recordings, you have never heard that from Mr. Depp, because he never used physical violence against Ms. Heard. Ms. Heard told you that Mr. Depp started abusing her right from the very beginning of her relationship, starting at the beginning of 2012. But she has repeatedly testified under oath differently to having spent a year of bliss with Mr. Depp before he ever laid a hand on her. And now, in this courtroom, she has suddenly erased an entire year of magic. She wants you to believe that instead of hitting her after a year of magic, Mr. Depp was hitting her immediately. The good times she has testified to about repeatedly in the past apparently never happened. And with the good times erased, Ms. Heard wants you to believe that she gave Mr. Depp a big knife that said, hasta la muerte, until death, to the man who supposedly would get drunk and high and beat her. Ms. Heard admitted to you during this trial that Mr. Depp always wears big, chunky rings on every finger. According to her, he was wearing these rings when he'd slap her, hit her, punch her in the face. But you have not seen a single photograph that reflects serious injuries Ms. Heard would have sustained if this was true. Not one. Ms. Heard testified to an incident in March 2013 when Mr. Depp supposedly hit her multiple times in the face while wearing rings. And this
भाई झूठ तो बहुत बोला है इसने, हर्ड ने ना.
झूठ तो मुझे लग रहा है दोनों ने ही बहुत बोला है.
हाँ मतलब इसका भी डेप का भी है, मगर उसका तो बहुत ही नेक्स्ट लेवल वाले तक है. मतलब कि उसका परजरी तक है. मतलब कि उसने ना इमेज जो यहाँ पे दिखाई भी है ना, कुछ जो कोर्ट के अंदर भी इमेजेस दिखाई हैं उसने, उसके अंदर भी उसने झूठ बोला हुआ है. कि मतलब उसने एक उसकी इमेज थी कि उसमें मतलब उसका फेस पे जहाँ पे वो मार्क था ना, जहाँ पे मतलब पंच किया हुआ था, वो सेम इमेज उन्होंने इन दोनों ने दिखाई कि एक ही सेम इमेज को एक विदाउट सैचुरेशन और एक विद सैचुरेशन दिखाई.
बहुत ज्यादा वो कर रखा था, एडिटिंग इतना ज्यादा कर रखा था.
हाँ वो एडिट कर रखा था इतना, और उसने वहाँ पे एकदम उसने वहाँ पे भी डिनाई कर दिया कि नहीं ये तो अलग इमेजेस हैं. और मतलब वो इस तरीके से रिप्लाई करते हैं कि उनके ऊपर ना आए, जैसे कि ये इमेज मैंने एडिट नहीं करी है इस तरीके से, ताकि मतलब किसी और ने करी हो तो.
लेकिन कोर्ट में तो अंडर ओथ दिखा रहे हैं ना, उसको दिखा रहे कि ये हुआ मेरे साथ. ऐसा मतलब अंडर ओथ अगर दिखा रहा है तो फिर तो वो एक तरीके से वो गलत एविडेंस यूज कर रहा है ना, फिर
वही
एडिटेड एविडेंस, मतलब झूठ
पर्जरी
तो
में आ
बोल ही
जाता
रहा
है,
है
हाँ।
अंडर ओथ। हाँ
और वो भी तो वो वाला देखा था कि इसने मतलब एमरेट ने बोला था कि ये मेरे ऊपर चढ़ गया था और एक टांग मेरे ऊपर रख ली थी और एक टांग ना इनका बेड था एक तरीके से, तो और बेड के कहता है एक टांग मेरे ऊपर रख ली और एक टांग बेड पे रख ली और मेरे को जमीन पे यूं दबा दिया और बेड का ना उसने उसने बोला कि बेड का एक हिस्सा उसने इतना मेरे को तेज दबाया कि बेड का जो उसने पैर बेड पे रखा हुआ था, बेड का एक इतना मोटा लॉग था, मतलब लकड़ी का बेड तक बहुत मोटी लकड़ी का बना हुआ था, तो वो हिस्सा टूट गया उसके पैर से। तो वो इतनी जान लगा रहा था अपने पैर से कि उसका वो बेड का उसने हिस्सा तोड़ दिया। फिर वह एक चैनल पे वीडियो, जैबी को ही पता है ना तेरे को, जैबी को जो रिएक्शन करता रहता है, तो वो एक वीडियो देख रहा था तो उसमें दिखाया कि ये ऐसी लकड़ी ना टूट ही नहीं सकती है कि कोई पैर रखे और लकड़ी टूट जाए, मतलब चिप हो जाए साइड से, ऐसे पॉसिबल ही नहीं है, क्योंकि वो बनाई इस तरीके से होता है कि जब तक कोई उसे चक्कू या किसी शार्प ऑब्जेक्ट से घुसा के ऐसे निकाले ना उल्टी फोर्स लगा के, तब तक वो चिप हो ही नहीं सकती है। और ये देखिए ये वाली इमेज जो अभी आएगी टीवी पे, देखिए जब ये जो अभी दिखा रही है
A pocket knife on the bed.
हाँ ये बता रही है ना पॉकेट नाइफ पड़ा हुआ है एक बेड पे, तो ये नाइफ से ही चिप, वो लकड़ी चिप ही नाइफ से हो सकती है, वरना मतलब शू से तो चिप ही नहीं हो सकती। तो ये भी उसने पूरा झूठ बोला हुआ है, ये दिखा रहे हैं ना नीचे चिप हुई पड़ी हुई है, साइड का बेड टुकड़ा निकला हुआ है बेड का, तो ये सिर्फ नाइफ से हो
And
सकता है,
here's
किसी
what
बूट
Miss
से
Heard
नहीं हो
looked
सकता।
like on the James Corden show the next
तो ये
day.
भी इसने पूरा झूठ बोला हुआ। बहुत मतलब बहुत ही ये
Indeed, you heard
आने
from
वाले
Miss
जो
Heard's own
स्टूडेंट्स
nurse,
होंगे ना
Erin
लॉ के,
Pilati,
वो
that she
बहुत
saw
पढ़ने
her a
वाले हैं
day
इस
or
केस
two
को।
afterwards and could not visualize the injuries Miss Heard described. Miss Heard did take pictures of herself after this alleged incident. But are the injuries reflected in these photographs consistent? That's the question. Are they consistent with the brutal assault and serious injuries Miss Heard has testified to? Or are these injuries more consistent with Mr. Depp's testimony that he and Miss Heard bumped heads while he was trying to restrain Miss Heard to keep her from attacking him?
और अगर इसको इतना ही मतलब वो अगर सही में मार ही रहा था इतना, तो इसने
Out of
3-4
Australia,
साल मतलब इसने
वही।
2020 तक क्यों वेट करा फिर?
अबे नहीं, इसका एक केस ना यूनाइटेड किंगडम में भी रजिस्टर्ड था जो इसने 2016 में कर दिया था और वो ये जीत भी गई थी। उसके बाद इसने कोई आर्टिकल लिखा है जिसमें उसको डिफेम करा गया है, तो उस आर्टिकल पे दोबारा उसने जॉनी डेप वालों ने 50 मिलियन का केस इस पे करा है और उसके रिवर्स में 100 मिलियन का केस एम्बर हर्ड ने डेप पे करा है।
तो यूके वाला केस कैसे उसमें तो हियरिंग हुई थी ऐसी? मेरे ख्याल से उसमें तो
नहीं
डायरेक्टली
नहीं, उसमें तो इतनी कुछ खास हियरिंग और इतने एविडेंस जो इसमें दिए गए हैं उतने एविडेंस भी नहीं दिए गए थे
उसमें तो बस यही बोल के ये लड़की है इसको ही मारा होगा बस कर दिया यूके वालों को।
और उस टाइम पे जो ये मतलब वो एक तरीके से इमेज बना रही थी ना कि मैं अब्यूज्ड हूँ, मेरे को बहुत पे लग गया है, मतलब ये सब, तो हर जगह इसने अपनी फोटो छपवा दी थी खासकर मैगजीन वगैरह में कि मेरे साथ वायलेंस हुआ है, सेक्सुअल वायलेंस हुआ है। एक तरीके से पहले से ही सिंपैथी गेन करके रख ली थी, वो सब प्लान था।
ये जागृत कौन है? जागृत
दोस्त है मेरा, सुपर चैट में लिख रहा है क्या कुछ?
हाँ चैट में लिखा हुआ है।
You heard from Mr. Connolly, Dr. Kipper, and Miss Floyd. All of them testified they did not observe any injuries to Miss Heard, and no one, including Miss Heard, testified that she sought medical treatment.
सही में भाई।
You also heard from Ben King.
मेरे को डिस्कॉर्ड का लिंक शेयर करियो एक बार यार अपने वाले जनरल चैनल वाले का। चल मिल गया।
He testified that Miss Heard didn't want to
उसको भी बुला रहे हैं यहाँ।
that she said, I
मैं सोच रहा हूँ पब्लिक ही कर देते हैं, पब्लिक या तो कुछ बना लो, पब्लिक कोई भी ज्वाइन
फिर
करने
पब्लिक वाला बना लेंगे ना, ये तो अपना प्राइवेट है, पब्लिक बना लो अपने चैनल के नाम से बना लो ना, ऑल टेक साइट्स का सर्वर,
एक सर्वर बना लेता हूँ।
When Miss Heard arrived in Los Angeles, she saw Travis McGivern, who also testified he observed no injuries, and her personal nurse, Erin Pilati, who documented no request for medical treatment and no injuries in her nursing notes for Miss Heard. You heard from Mr. Depp's sister, Christy, that she also saw Miss Heard when she arrived back to Los Angeles and observed no injuries on Ms. Heard. Christie testified that when she told Ms. Heard her fighting with Mr. Depp was unsustainable, Ms. Heard responded that Christie should get off her cross, that Mr. Depp liked her feisty. Ms. Heard's testimony about what occurred in Australia just doesn't add up. That's because there was a monster in that house in Australia, but it wasn't Mr. Depp. It was Ms. Heard. Other than Ms. Heard's testimony, all the evidence you've seen in this trial shows that it was Ms. Heard who attacked and grievously wounded Mr. Depp when she threw a vodka bottle at him, severing his finger. Mr. Depp told Dr. Kipper that when Dr. Kipper arrived to treat Mr. Depp's finger. You've seen the pictures of the bar area in Australia with the broken vodka bottles on the ground and trails of blood drops on the floor and a bloody tissue on the floor. You've heard from Ben King that the tip of Mr. Depp's finger was found in the same bar area. And you heard from Dr. Gilbert that the injury to Mr. Depp's finger could have been caused exactly as he described. And interestingly, you heard from Christina Sexton that Ms. Heard told her that Mr. Depp injured his finger while swinging a bottle
मैच भी
around,
है इसके मैच
smashing the phone.
मैच भी हॉटस्टार भी है मेरे पास वो भी स्ट्रीम कर सकता हूँ मैं
But swinging
नहीं नहीं
a
नहीं नहीं नहीं
bottle
मत करना, वो तो पहले ही वो आ जाएगा
नहीं
हॉटस्टार का।
नहीं कर रहा हाँ उसने तो पहले भी पंगे करे थे हॉटस्टार ने एक रील के लिए इतने पंगे कर दिए थे
10 सेकंड की रील नहीं थी उसके लिए 4 बार वो डलवा दिया
The evidence presented at this trial shows that this is not the only time that Ms. Heard disclosed a sexual assault at a convenient time for purposes of litigation she's involved in. The first time Ms. Heard claimed that Mr. Depp sexually assaulted her in the Bahamas in December 2015 was after Tara Roberts, the manager of Mr. Depp's island, submitted a sworn statement in the UK action describing the incident she testified to in
डिस्कॉर्ड का ना अपने इसमें डिस्क्रिप्शन में चैनल डिस्क्रिप्शन में डाल देना अगर बना
yelling and then pleading with Mr. Depp to stay while clawing at his hair and clothes and left Mr. Depp with an injury to his face. That's the first time she disclosed it.
नहीं इधर नहीं है उसके
नहीं ये तो मैंने तुम्हें वैसे ही भेज दिया
हाँ वो मैं कह रहा मैं तो आ गया
2 weeks after the events in Australia.
वहीं ज्वाइन कर लूं
अभी रुक जा अभी मेरे को अपने वाले यहाँ पे वाले डिस्कॉर्ड पे भी शिफ्ट करना पड़ेगा ना अभी जो पीसी पे
Whitney is the only witness that you heard from that backs up Ms. Heard's version of events. She's it. And the only witness, other than Ms. Heard, who claims to have seen Mr. Depp physically attack Ms. Heard. But just like Ms. Heard's version of the events in Australia, her testimony about the staircase incident and that of her sister Whitney's just doesn't square up with the other evidence in this trial. Their testimony is contradicted by the testimony of Travis McGivern and Debbie Lloyd, who were there that night. Ms. Heard and Whitney testified that Mr. Depp threw a Red Bull can that hit or almost hit Ms. Lloyd. Ms. Lloyd testified that never happened. Mr. McGivern testified that it was Ms. Heard who threw a can at Mr. Depp. Ms. Heard testified that Whitney was between her and Mr. Depp when she punched him. Mr. McGivern testified that he was the one between Ms. Heard and Mr. Depp when Ms. Heard punched Mr. Depp. Ms. Heard testified that Mr. Depp was able to get his hands in her hair, yank her, and then hit her in the face with the cast he had on. But you heard from Ms. Lloyd and Dr. Colbert, Mr. Depp's medical doctor, who treated Mr. Depp's finger injury, that Mr. Depp's finger was in a delicate state. He had a pin in his finger, a skin graft, and a soft cast that immobilized Mr. Depp's 2 middle fingers. And tellingly, the only picture of an injury from this incident is of Mr. Depp with a shiner. And then we have May 21st, 2016. Ms. Heard testified that Mr. Depp threw a phone at her face, causing a visible injury. Ms. Heard has shown you pictures she claims to show this injury. But these photographs
आया तो हुआ है बोल तो कुछ नहीं रहा
You heard from Mr. Dumeister.
अबे पहले बोल रहा था पता नहीं अब उसके बाद बंद हो गया बोलना
These photos were stored in a photo editing.
मुझे लगा जब इसने देखा कि हम खुद स्ट्रीम कर रहे हैं तब से ही चुप हो गया
And these photos show
पहले से लग रहा था कि हम दूसरे का वो स्ट्रीम कर रहे हैं
These two photographs were taken at the exact same time and have the exact same filing, but they are visually different. One shows significantly more redness on Ms. Heard's face than the other, which doesn't show any injury at all. Ms. Heard testified that the difference is explained by turning on a light.
ये वाली देख रहे हैं?
Ms. Heard could have taken a picture, turned on
अच्छा
a
बात
light,
चल
and then
रही
taken another picture with
है
every hair
क्या
in
बोल
the
रहे हो
exact same place.
ये वाली जो
हाँ ये
images
वाली हाँ ये वाली
It's
हाँ
impossible.
ये देखी थी सैचुरेशन और वो बदल के ऐसे दिखाया दिया था
Moreover, you heard from multiple witnesses.
जैसे उसको कह रही है कि एक लाइट ऑन करने के बाद है, एक लाइट ऑन करने के पहले
Officer Tyler Haddon,
तो वो इमेजेस बिल्कुल वही सेम है। उसने उस बंदे ने एक के ऊपर एक इमेज रख के देख ली थी ये, तो कह रहा था ये देखो कोई फर्क ही
who saw
नहीं।
Ms. Heard on or after May 21st and saw no injuries to her face before she showed up to that courthouse with a mark on May 27th. And the very next day, after Ms. Heard walked into court with what appeared to be a bruise on her face to obtain a domestic violence restraining order against Mr. Depp, Ms. Heard was photographed laughing with her best friend, fresh-faced, with no bruise on her face. The mountain of evidence that Mr. Depp abused Ms. Heard is simply not there. What we have is a mountain of unproven allegations that are wild, over the top, and implausible. And you can't pick and choose which of these wild allegations to believe and which ones to disregard. You either believe all of it or none of it. Either Mr. Depp sexually assaulted Ms. Heard with a bottle in Australia, or Ms. Heard got up on that stand in front of all of you and made up that horrific tale of abuse. Either she's a victim of truly horrific abuse, or she is a woman who is willing to
आ जाओ फिर
say
शिफ्ट कर लेते हैं वहीं
absolutely
पे।
anything. It is disturbing to think that Ms. Heard would make up the horrific tales of abuse that she testified to in this courtroom. But this case doesn't come down
ये
to
तो
whether
कोई
you
आया
believe
नहीं
Ms.
लेकिन
Heard or you believe Mr. Depp.
पता
This
नहीं
case comes down to whether you believe Ms. Heard or you believe Mr. Depp, Christy Dombrowski, Sean Bett, Malcolm Connolly, Travis McGivern, Starling Jenkins, Keenan Wyatt, Dr. Kipper, nurses Debbie Lloyd and Erin Filati, Tara Roberts, Ben King, Kate James, Kate Moss, Dr. Colbert, Morgan Knight, Morgan Tremaine, Officers Melissa Sines, Officers Tyler Haddon, Officer William Gatlin, and Beverly Leonard. What Ms. Heard testified to in this courtroom is a story
जैसे
of
नकुल
far
2 मिनट
too
स्ट्रीम
many
पॉज भी कर सकते हो आप ऐसे अगर चाहो
but
तो
the overwhelming evidence
पॉज एज इन हाँ
and weight of that evidence shows
नहीं मतलब
that
वैसे
Mr.
डायरेक्ट
Depp
पॉज नहीं कर सकता मैं मतलब मगर मेरे को
is
बंद
not
करनी पड़ेगी
Ms.
चीजें
Heard's
जो चल
story.
रही हैं और दूसरी स्क्रीन में डायरेक्ट शिफ्ट कर दूंगा।
It was an act of profound cruelty, not just to Mr. Depp, but to true survivors of domestic abuse. For Ms. Heard
एक
to
बार
hold
वो
herself
स्टिकर
out
भेजा
as a
मैंने देखना है
public
इसके उस
figure
पे
representing domestic abuse.
वो तो मैंने दूसरी
It
स्क्रीन
was
खोली हुई है,
false,
ये
it was
तूने व्हाट्सएप पे भेजा
defamatory,
वही वाला ना।
and it caused
हाँ
irreparable harm. And to talk more about that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague,
वो मैंने
friend,
देख लिया था।
Mr. Chip.
ये वैसे दोनों दोनों इसके अटर्नी है या फिर एक ही है लॉयर और एक ये जो
एक एसोसिएट है
मतलब
जो
पार्टनर्स हैं
कैमिल वाली एसोसिएट होगी और ये जो दूसरे वाला ये मेन लॉयर है मतलब
ये
जैसे
नहीं मेरे ख्याल से मेन वो है जो वो है
कैमिल वेस्केज नहीं
हाँ
अबे मतलब ये बड़ा लॉयर है तो अब ये सिर्फ मेन स्टेटमेंट्स देता है ना उस बाकी काम वो करती है।
अच्छा
जैसे कि तूने वो सूट्स देखा है ना जैसे उसमें हार्वी डेंट कह रहा हूँ हार्वी स्पेक्टर मेन होता है और वो साथ में वो जो दूसरे वाला होता है।
पूरा नहीं कंप्लीट करा मैंने मैं अब याद भी नहीं इसलिए मैंने बहुत पहले देखा था ये एक आध
And
सीजन
thanks to all of you
तो जैसे
EVP
उसके भी दो
for
तीन है ना,
taking
जैसे
so
कि
much
एक बीच
time
वाली
over
ये
these last several weeks to
एम्बरट की
listen
जो
to Mr. Depp,
भी जो थोड़ी
to his friends,
आंटी टाइप है,
his
ये
family,
मेन है।
थोड़ा सा
and to so
इसे
many
करोगे
others
आप
who have come
ये देखोगे
forward
गूगल ने क्या करा
physically
है इसका
in this
कमील वेस्केस
courtroom,
का
some
कमील
from a very long
लॉजिस्टिक्स
distance,
कर दिया
to tell
जब
you
इसका
the
नाम लेता है
truth,
वो इसको
and to find
अच्छा।
नीचे
after
उसमें
so many years,
कमील लेस्किस
क्लोज
the record.
कैप्शंस में हाँ
As Ms. Vasquez said,
वेस्केस का
you
कमील
have now come to
क्या
know
कर दिया
the real
लॉजिस्टिक्स हाँ
Amber Heard.
कमील लॉजिस्टिक्स नाम
Scary.
दिखा रहा था नीचे
We
जब
also
उसको
told you at
थैंक
the
यू
start of
करता
this
है
अच्छा।
trial you were going to come to know the real Johnny Depp.
डिस्क्रिप्शन में डाला हुआ।
Not the
नहीं
many
नहीं उसी में
characters you've seen him
क्लोज
play.
कैप्शन जो चल रहे हैं ना
So wonderful.
अच्छा अच्छा
Subtitles
अच्छा
मतलब-
अच्छा
But the
नीचे
man
यहाँ पे
himself-
समझ गया,
सबटाइटल्स सब
सबटाइटल्स में।
You've met the real Johnny Depp. You have heard that Mr. Depp came from
पीछे
humble,
करोगे तो
very
देखेगा वो तो
difficult,
जब वो ये आता है और उसको बस थैंक करता है बस यहीं से थोड़ा सा आगे
Thank you, Camille. Logistics are not our
इसने तो खुद लॉजिस्टिक्स बोला
strong
है।
suit.
अरे नहीं, मगर इसने मेरे को अच्छा इसने कमील इसने कुछ और सेंटेंस बोला था और उसने उसका लॉजिस्टिक्स और इसका कमील दोनों पकड़ के एक ही नाम बना दिया गूगल ने।
अच्छा
And thanks
वही
to the movies. But the man himself, Mr. Depp, when he was a little
नॉट
boy,
अ
was
स्ट्रॉन्ग
one-eyed
सूट
because he had to wear an eye patch for some time. His mother
मेरे को
used to
स्ट्रीम
hit
2
his
मिनट लेट
father
दिख रही है ना
with the
आपको जहाँ से
kids,
दिखी है
including
ये
young
भी
Mr.
थोड़ी सी
Depp.
दिक्कत है
And when his mother got violent, Mr. Depp would retreat and find a place to hide. Sometimes he and his sister Christy would find a place to hide together. Mr. Depp never hit back. And like his father, he either stood up and took the violence or he retreated from it. Those are habits he returned to later when he found himself in a relationship with another person who returned his love with abuse, physical abuse. And despite this long, unhappy history with his mother, Johnny never turned his back on her. In her elder years, Mr. Depp moved his mother to California, and he moved her to Los Angeles right across the street from his house so his two children could get to know her. He hired nurses for his mother. He made sure to take care of her and to make her comfortable. She never went to hospice. She had the nurses make her comfortable to the day she died. And from those humble and difficult beginnings, Mr. Depp grew into one of the greatest actors and movie stars of his generation. Now, he came to Los Angeles with his first love as a young man, planning to be a musician. Music had been a part of his life ever since he found peace himself in his room.
और भाई चल रहा है, अभी जीता कोई नहीं है,
When he was escaping. And he would
मगर
learn to
हम
play
जॉनी भाई के
guitar
साथ
and
हैं।
use it as solace. But it was an actor as his star began its rise, as he appeared in films too many to mention, including, of course, his iconic role as Captain Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise.
बंद तो दोनों की
Fame
मूवीज
came
होनी
with
चाहिए थी वैसे
challenges to Mr.
वही ना,
Depp.
मतलब
मतलब
एक बंदे का वो,
अगर
हाँ
होनी-
Experience for a shy
बिल्कुल।
young
होनी थी तो
from
दोनों की
Kentucky
होनी थी
to be thrust
गलत
into the limelight,
अगर उसने भी करा है तो
by
उसने भी दोनों ने ही
paparazzi,
करा है गलत
and to have even his very name become a brand. But he did his best to live a private, quiet life, and despite it all, and over the years built a reputation as a respected
भाई
artist
पूरी
and
उससे
as a
पायरेट्स
decent,
ऑफ कैरिबियन में
very
उसका
well-liked
फ्रेंचाइज से
man
निकाल दिया जो
who
मेन
heard from many
फ्रेंचाइज थी
Mr.
वही
Depp
तो।
dated major
उसके बाद तो
figures
इसने वो कर दिया
like
कि
Winona
मैं
Ryder,
कभी
Kate
उनके लिए
Moss,
डिज्नी के लिए कभी काम ही नहीं
and
करूंगा।
Vanessa Paradis, with whom
इसमें
he
बोल रहे कि
spent
कोई भी कभी
40
कॉन्ट्रैक्ट
years together,
डिज्नी के साथ
and
साइन
with
नहीं
whom
करेगा ये आगे
they
से।
had their children.
ये नहीं पता था
Before Amber Heard, ladies and gentlemen, no woman ever before Amber Heard ever claimed that Mr. Depp raised a hand to her in his 58 years. And no other woman since Ms. Heard made that false claim back on May 27th, 2016, and repeated it in her December 2018 op-ed. Has any woman come forward since? This is Me Too without any Me Too. To the contrary, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Kate Moss 2 days ago.
उसने बोला अभी this is Me Too, मतलब एम्बर हर्ड ने जो करा है that is Me Too without any Me Too.
Testified in any proceeding ever, a very private person, testified that Mr. Depp never abused her, and that Ms. Heard lied to you, and she lied to you twice when she told you.
Objection, Your Honor. That Ms.
अभी भी ऑब्जेक्शन चल रहे हैं? अब किस बात के ऑब्जेक्शन चल रहे हैं भाई?
Ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying,
पूरे इसमें ऑब्जेक्शन ही
Ms.
तो
Heard lied to you twice when she suggested to you that Mr. Depp pushed Kate Moss down the stairs. You told her, you heard her say just 2 days ago that Mr. Depp never did that, and he never hit her, and he never kicked her. That was one of...
Objection, Your Honor. That's not what she testified to.
Exactly.
We just discussed that.
Thank you. They're still at it. Ms. Heard and her lawyers have spent much of this trial talking about...
एम्बर हर्ड ने फुद्दू लॉयर हायर कर लिए
Mr. Depp is no saint, and he has never claimed to be one. He has made mistakes in his life, as we all have.
सिर्फ एक ही टाइप का ईयर से ऑब्जेक्शन ही डाले जा रहे हैं क्यों इतने ईयर से
We told you in the opening
कोई
statement.
इतने ईयर से डाले कि खुद ही वो अपने आप ही ईयर से बोल रहे थे और जब खुद पूछा तब भी ईयर से डाल दिया
वही
But he is not
खुद ही बोला हमें इसने खुद
खुद
पूछ के खुद ही ईयर से बोला उसने तो मुझे किसी और ने बोला होता तो ठीक है मगर उस बंदे ने खुद ही ईयर से कर
have his life, his legacy destroyed by a vicious lie. And this
जज
is,
तक
as
बोलता
Ms. Vasquez said, this is
यू
the
आते
6th anniversary of that. There is a world of difference between having substance abuse problems and being a physical abuser. Ms. Heard falsely accused Mr. Depp of beating her. That was her first allegation, and you know why, and you know that wasn't true. Then, years after the fact, for the first time,
भाई लाइव वॉचिंग देख रहे हैं इनके चैनल पे कितने आ रही है जहाँ से मैं देख रहा हूँ 1.5 लाख वॉचिंग आ रही है
over time, and they need to be stopped. And those
मेरे को दिखाई नहीं दे रहा
false
लेकिन ये चीज
accusations
नहीं वो मैंने काटा हुआ है ना
caused more harm to Mr. Depp than her fists ever did. And make no mistake, Ms. Heard has admitted, unlike Mr. Depp, Ms. Heard has admitted on the audio tapes you've heard at this trial, and Ms. Vasquez just played you a few of them, she has admitted repeatedly to physically abusing Mr. Depp. And I would just like to take a minute to talk about the harm to Mr. Depp and his family. You have heard from several of the people in Mr. Depp's life about the damage Ms. Heard's lies have done to him. You heard from his sister Christine, who told you how hard it has been on his family and on her little brother personally. You heard from Mr. Depp's friend of 4 decades, and that speaks volumes about Mr. Depp. He has lifetime friends who appear for him. Mr. Baruch told you how Mr. Depp and his family had been, quote, completely wrecked, unquote, by Ms. Heard's lies. You heard Mr. Depp testify that he has lost nothing less than everything because of Ms. Heard's lies. Nothing less than everything. You heard about Mr. Depp's children, Jack and Lily Rose. His children have had to hear these allegations since 2016. And then when that started to die down, they had to hear them again. This time in December 2018, this time in the Washington Post, which is a national and international publication. And Mr. Depp has had to live with the knowledge that his children will keep hearing those false rumors and statements against him. Mr. Depp has millions of fans, people who grew up watching him on 21 Jump Street, which is something you heard mock on one of the tapes that was played to you. Or they grew up watching him play the swashbuckling pirate Captain Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, or Willy Wonka. Mr. Depp means something to those people. And those people mean a lot to Mr. Depp. He's a fond memory from childhood or adolescence, or adulthood. And to tarnish him as an abuser is to destroy him in the eyes of many of these people who will never look at him the same way again. And because of what Ms. Heard did, and because of what she said, Mr. Depp will go to his grave knowing no matter what he does, no matter the outcome of this trial, there are people who used to look up to him who now believe that he beat a woman, which is the worst thing you can say about a man. Beyond the personal and emotional effects of Ms. Heard's lies, their impact on Mr. Depp and his family, the damage she inflicted on his reputation and career is undeniable. There's an old saying that a good reputation takes a lifetime to build, but only a second to destroy. Mr. Depp spent, in fact, a lifetime building his reputation as one of the greatest actors and movie stars of his generation, an iconic figure respected and liked throughout Hollywood and recognized and admired throughout the world. You heard evidence from Jack Wiggum, who was here today, Mr. Depp's agent, who explained that Mr. Depp, quote, was very well regarded and respected by peers in the artistic community, unquote. And you heard further testimony from Mr. Wiggum that Mr. Depp had a deal with Disney to play Captain Jack Sparrow in the 6th movie sequel of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise for $22.5 million. But, as Mr. Wiggum explained, all of that changed when Ms. Heard published her op-ed in December of 2018 in the Washington Post. Quoting from the testimony you heard by Mr. Wiggum, quote, after the op-ed, it was impossible to get him a studio film, which is what we normally would have focused on in that time period, unquote. Another quote, it was on the damage, the impact of this op-ed, as opposed to the other stories that you saw, the other publications. Mr. Wiggum explained why this one was so damaging. Quote, it was a first-person account. I mean, from the victim. It's extremely impactful. You know, with respect to Johnny, it was catastrophic because it was coming from a first-person account. It was not from a journalist. It was coming from someone observing. It was from someone saying, this happened to me, unquote. You also heard from Richard Marks, an expert in the inner workings of Hollywood and the entertainment industry, who explained that the impact of Ms. Heard's allegations on Mr. Depp was devastating. Quote, it's devastating. It's the type of claim, the Me Too claim of sexual violence, domestic abuse, that has canceled a list of actors, unquote. And for many, and Mr. Depp would agree with this, rightfully so, Me Too is an important movement, a movement that Mr. Depp
चलेगी मेरे ख्याल कुछ टाइम तक कोई नहीं तेरे को जाना है तो मतलब बाद में ज्वाइन कर लेंगे वो तो अपने कोई वो दिक्कत नहीं
पूरा आप लाइव स्ट्रीम कर रहे हो अभी
हाँ मैं तो पूरा कर दूंगा मतलब अपना काम करता रहूंगा साथ साथ जब तक चलेगा
चलो अभी तो चलता हूँ मैं काफी आधा घंटा हो गया बाद आता हूँ फिर
Amber Heard is not a true victim. And Mr. Depp certainly is not an abuser. Again, nobody has come out of the woodwork to say, Me Too. This is the unique and singular Me Too case where there's not a single Me Too. In fact, to the contrary, Kate Moss, who was in a romantic relationship with Mr. Depp for 3 years, which he broke off, came forward to say, no, he never pushed her down any stairs. And you heard Doug Banya, an expert in internet and social media analytics, testify to the impact that Ms. Heard's allegations had on Mr. Depp's popularity. Ms. Heard's lawyers tried to tell you that all of the damage done to Mr. Depp's career was because of his own behavior, because he was sometimes unprofessional or sometimes late to set. But that doesn't hold up. Mr. Depp has been a major figure in Hollywood for decades. Yes, Mr. Depp was late to set sometimes. But as Richard Marx testified, quote, when you hire Johnny Depp, you get all of Johnny Depp, which includes being late, unquote. Keenan Wyatt, who has worked for decades as a sound engineer on some of Mr. Depp's films, said much the same thing. And by the way, Mr. Wyatt is not and never has been an employee of Mr. Depp. He's just worked with him on movies. Mr. Depp wasn't canceled by Hollywood because he was sometimes late to set. He was canceled because Ms. Heard falsely accused him of domestic violence and sexual violence on the pages of the Washington Post on December 18, 2018, repeating the prior lies of May 17, 2016. And as you saw at trial, Ms. Heard published the op-ed on December 18, 2018, 2 years after her public allegations of domestic abuse. Ms. Heard's publication of the op-ed coincided with the release of her major movie Aquaman that December. And it coincided as well with her announcement on Twitter that she was becoming an ACLU ambassador for women's rights. And in that op-ed, Ms. Heard repeated her false allegations against Mr. Depp. Now, she didn't mention his name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who and what Ms. Heard was talking about. Ms. Heard got on the stand and tried to tell you that the op-ed was not about Mr. Depp. She then said, well, it wasn't just about Mr. Depp. But she couldn't deny, and this was yesterday, that this was at least partly about Mr. Depp. The op-ed obviously is about Mr. Depp, and the testimony at trial proves that. You will recall testimony from the ACLU's representative, an attorney, stating that Mr. Depp's name was included in drafts of the op-ed and that they and others understood that the op-ed was about Mr. Depp. Specifically, the ACLU representative testified, among other things, quote, based on my review of prior drafts of the op-ed, I knew that she was referring to Johnny Depp and the marriage, unquote. Ms. Heard's claim that the op-ed is not about Mr. Depp is just another one of her many, many lies. In fact, what you have seen time and time again through the course of this trial is that Ms. Heard lies. She lies all the time about things that are important and the things that aren't important. She just can't seem to stop. And as Ms. Vasquez said, what she routinely does is she doesn't take ownership or responsibility for anything, and she has an excuse for everything. But in this courtroom, confronted with the evidence, she can't run away from her own words. As my colleague said, words matter, and Ms. Heard is condemned by her own words. So Tom, let's please take a look at the words she used in her op-ed, which is Plaintiff's Exhibit 1, and which Ms. Heard published in December 2018, 2 years after she first publicly accused Mr. Depp of being an abuser on May 27, 2016. The title of the op-ed reads, as you can see, quote, Amber Heard, I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. That has to change, unquote. Below that, Ms. Heard states, quote, then 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out, unquote. And below that, Ms. Heard states, quote, I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse, unquote. Each of those statements clearly refers to Ms. Heard's allegations against Mr. Depp. And taken collectively, their message and their implication about Mr. Depp is clear, i.e. that Ms. Heard is a survivor of domestic abuse and that Mr. Depp is a perpetrator. The context in the rest of the op-ed makes that clear as well. Consider, for instance, this line, quote, "Imagine a powerful man is a ship, like the Titanic. That ship is a huge enterprise. When it strikes an iceberg, there are a lot of people on board desperate to patch up holes, not because they believe in or even care about the ship, but because their own fates depend upon the enterprise," unquote. Everyone in Hollywood knew, and everyone in this courtroom now knows exactly what Ms. Heard intended those words to mean. The ship, the Titanic, is Mr. Depp, and Ms. Heard was the iceberg that sank him. That's precisely what Ms. Heard was saying in the op-ed. And in just the same way, everyone in Hollywood knew, and Hollywood and elsewhere knew exactly what Ms. Heard meant by the words, quote, "2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse," unquote. That was a clear reference to the day 2 years earlier, on May 27th, 2016. And as Ms. Vasquez said, that was 6 years to the day. That's when his life ended. That was 6 years ago to this day, when Ms. Heard, on May 27th, 2016, walked into court with her publicist, Jody Gottlieb, having tipped off TMZ, with an alleged mark on her face to accuse Mr. Depp of abuse. As always, Ms. Heard was quite mindful of her image. She was careful to portray herself as the innocent representative of abuse survivors, and by implication, Mr. Depp as the perpetrator of domestic abuse. She was the woman who, in the words of her title, supposedly, quote, "spoke up against sexual violence," unquote. Now, Ms. Heard has done a lot to try to walk away from the title in particular. That's true to form. She has testified that she didn't write it, and she will argue later that she shouldn't be held liable because she didn't write it. But as the court's instructions, which you heard this morning, make clear, Ms. Heard didn't have to personally write any part of the op-ed for her to defame Mr. Depp through implication in the Washington Post. And let's please, Tom, turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 3. Ms. Heard, as you all can see on the screen, retweeted the article, including the title on her Twitter page. Ms. Heard put her name on it. And she proudly declared, quote, "Today I published this op-ed in the Washington Post, ellipsis," unquote. Her tweet includes the title with the words, quote, "I spoke up against sexual violence," unquote, prominently featured. Nowhere in this tweet or anywhere else does Ms. Heard disavow the title. To the contrary, she's proclaiming it. And at the same time Ms. Heard posted this tweet, she posted another, which you can see right beneath it. Quote, "I'm honored to announce my role as an ACLU
कुछ खाने का लेके आया।
हो गया, मैंने ध्यान दिया।
हैं?
कोहली आउट हो गया।
अबे यार, रुक उस पे लगाता हूँ अपना लैपटॉप।
No mistake.
मतलब पहले आउट हो गया था, ध्यान मैंने अभी दिया।
In the wake of the Me Too movement, with her ACLU
2-3 ओवर पहले हो गया था।
and a major movie coming out, Ms. Heard was trading on her accusations.
बट भाई कोहली के लिए तो देख रहे हैं हम।
She was reminding everyone of those allegations.
वही ना।
She was once again taking on the role of her life.
काफी पहले हो गई, तो मुझे लग रहा है पहली बॉल पे ना होके चला गया वो दोबारा।
नहीं 8 बॉल खेली।
कितने रन?
And she was once again casting Mr. Depp एक छक्का मारा।
चल छक्का मार दिया ना, ठीक है। कुछ
एक 8 बॉल में एक छक्का मारा है, मतलब 2 बॉल पे रन बनाए हैं 8 बॉलों में।
क्या ही कर रहा भाई ये ना।
So we'd just like to ask you pleased to spend a few minutes with me going through that. Tom, would you please put up the special verdict form so the jury can see it?
भाई जैसे पहले खेलता था एग्रेसिवली वैसे ही खेले तो तभी मजा आता है कोहली की इनिंग्स में। तो अभी इतने शांत तरीके से खेलता है तो कोई मजा ही नहीं आता। उस दिन क्या मस्त शोर मजा मचा के गालियां दे के खेल रहा था जब 70 बनाए तब बढ़िया खेलता है ये।
You will see here
दिल्ली से है ये, दिल्ली से है ये और इन्हें इसको शांत कराना, शांत कराएंगे तो फिर निकलेगा कैसे गेम से दिल्ली के बंदे से।
defamatory statements in the op-ed that form the basis of Mr. Depp's claim against Ms. Heard. You've heard those three statements many times, but they bear repeating. I promise just once more here. One, quote, I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. That has to change, unquote. Two, then 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out, unquote. Three, I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse, unquote. Now, there are 7 questions that you will need to please answer with respect to each of those statements. So that's 21 questions, I think, but 7 as to each statement. 1, was the statement made or published by Ms. Heard? 2, was the statement about Mr. Depp? 3, was the statement false? 4, did the statement have a defamatory implication about Mr. Depp? 5, was the defamatory implication designed and intended by Ms. Heard? 6, was the defamatory implication conveyed to someone other than Mr. Depp? 7, did Ms. Heard make the statement with actual malice? Which is Her Honor's claim, meaning did Ms. Heard make the statement knowing it was false or with reckless disregard?
क्या बोल दूं भाई?
और भाई पार्टीदार ने छक्का मार दिया।
आ रही है ना मेरी आवाज
The evidence clearly shows that the answers to those 7 questions are all
बढ़िया छक्का मार गए।
And if you answer yes,
भाई इसकी टाइमिंग और स्विंग बहुत सही है।
which you should,
सेकंड क्वालीफायर चल रहा है ना भाई आरसीबी का।
to state the amount of damages to which Mr. Depp is entitled.
भाई मैंने वैसे लेकिन ये देखा है अब जो भी नए बंदे आते हैं ना लोग पुराने बंदों से कंपेयर करने लग जाते हैं फिर सबका कॉन्फिडेंस गिर जाता है बिल्कुल इन लोगों का।
वो तो है ही भाई, वो तो है।
And it is entirely within your discretion.
खासकर ये कमेंटेटर्स जो है ना ये कमेंटेटर्स जो बैठे हैं एक मंजरेकर और एक ये
भाई
मंजरेकर तो कुछ भी बोलता रहता।
भाई ये कमेंटेटर
भी अब कुछ भी बोलने लग गया भाई। पहले
चने के झाड़ पे चढ़ाते हैं ना ये।
गावस्कर भी अब भी
काम करते हैं
लग गया। अरे मैंने आज वो दिन में मीम भेजा था वो देखा था तुमने? उंगलियां फेरना वाला।
हाँ देखा था भाई। ये अबे ये उसका है। मेरे को लग रहा है वो विवेक राजदान है ना, या तो उसका बोला या तो वो आकाश चोपड़ा का।
हाँ यही दोनों बोल सकते हैं।
इन दोनों का ही काम है। नकुल तूने देखा था?
मैंने नहीं देखा वो वाला शायद।
अबे
थोड़ा सा ऊपर करो स्क्रॉल। ग्रुप पे स्क्रॉल करो थोड़ा ऊपर।
ग्रुप देख क्या था?
जहाँ पे अन अकेडमी वाला है उसके ऊपर ही जस्ट।
आकाश इंस्टीट्यूट से ऊपर है।
हाँ नहीं हाँ आकाश वाले से
आकाश वाले के जस्ट नीचे बहुत ऊपर हो गया।
जस्ट नीचे होगा 3।
अच्छा उंगलियां फेरना मिल गया
देख
ही पर कहाँ डाल रहे हैं वो भी उतना ही इम्पोर्टेंट है। भाई ये इन्होंने लाइव बोला है कमेंट्री में।
हाँ भाई और क्या।
वाह भाई क्या ही कमेंट्री चल रही है।
बोलना क्या चाह रहा था ये भी नहीं समझ आ रहा है।
हम क्रिकेट देखते तो अपने को समझ आ जाएगा भाई ठीक है क्या बोलना चाह रहा है, और किसी को कॉन्टेक्स्ट पता ना हो ना फिर तो मतलब सही जूते पड़ने पे काम है।
referring
इन्हीं
to
का मीटू हो जाएगा अभी तो। हाँ एक डेप भाई का जैसा इसका भी हो जाएगा।
So the USA Today interpreted it that way, and so did
ये
many
कैंसिल
others.
वाला बढ़िया भेजा ना
But
नवी
exact
स्टिकर
interpretation that Ms.
हाँ
Heard
बढ़िया
and
है
ACLU
इसके
intended
लिए कुनाल के लिए।
them to have.
यार। मैंने नकुल की
Thomas,
स्ट्रीम में
will you
म्यूट
please
कर
pull
दी।
up plaintiff's exhibit?
मैंने भी अभी कर
मेरे
रखी
को
है वो
अपनी एको आ रही
थोड़ा
थी।
सा हाँ एको आ रही है और ऊपर से धीरे चलती है ना।
हाँ वो तो है ही।
And this was
तो
expected.
धीरे मतलब बाद में एको आती है। मेरे को लगता है मैंने बोल दिया फिर लगता है फिर से क्यों बोल रहा हूँ मैं 2 बार।
वही तो तभी तो मैंने म्यूट करी।
About Ms. Heard's claims of abuse against
म्यूट
Mr.
ही करना
Depp,
सालो,
she walked
बंद मत
into
करना।
court with her publicist.
हाँ
बंद नहीं कर रहा भाई।
The domestic violence, the no notice.
हाँ तू बंद कर ले।
Ex parte, meaning Mr. Depp's lawyer
मैं आगे
was
बंद
not
करूँगा।
informed, and he was already in New York.
शटर तो बंद कर दिया।
Testified Ms. Heard was relevant.
शटर तो मैंने बंद कर दिया, खा पी रहा हूँ ना
Don't
थोड़ा।
need a domestic violence restraining order when your
पहले भी खा रहा था।
husband across the continent.
हाँ मतलब पता जब तू आया ना मैं कुछ पीने वाला था, जैसे ही तू आया तूने बोला मेरे मुंह से वो निकलने वाला
On May
था।
27, 2016, with a purported mark in her face. Everyone knew exactly who and what Ms. Heard was referring to in the op-ed. She was
आज कोहली फिर आउट हो गए क्या?
हाँ भाई।
Let's take questions 2
यही
and
तो
3.
दुख मनाने आया था मैं। यही दुख मनाने आया था मैं। अभी चला गया था फिर आया था।
Were each of the statements false?
वही मैंने थोड़ी देर पहले देखा था यार, अकेला ही बैठा है नकुल। फिर मैं कुछ काम के लिए बाहर चला गया, अब आके देखा तो
Clear answer is yes.
तुम दोनों बैठे
The
हो।
statements understood in the context of the op-ed itself and in the broader context of the press coverage of Ms. Heard walking into the court with a mark on her face to obtain a
आज भी
domestic
सही मार
violence
रहा है वैसे
restraining order against Mr. Depp
डुप्लेसी भी सही मार रहा है और
आराम आराम।
clearly imply that Mr. Depp
कोहली
physically
यार
and
मेरे को तो
sexually abused
मेरा
Ms. Heard.
मेन तो वो ही ये होता है कि कोहली की इनिंग्स
Evidence
आरसीबी का मैच देखने का तो फायदा तभी होता है जब कोहली की इनिंग्स अच्छी जाए।
shows that those allegations
जिस दिन बढ़िया जाती है उस दिन मजा आ जाता है उसके।
ये साउथ अफ्रीका वाली सीरीज में भी नहीं ले रहे ना कोहली को। कोहली और रोहित दोनों ही नहीं है।
he did not sexually abuse.
दोनों
रेस्ट
को
दिया है
रेस्ट
ना, रेस्ट दिया है।
हाँ मतलब
कोहली
रेस्ट
को तो कुछ दोनों को ज्यादा नहीं रेस्ट करा रहे लेकिन
और सिर्फ 5th टेस्ट में वापस ला रहे हैं ना।
While Mr. Depp's name will be
5th टेस्ट
forever
में
tarnished by these
ताकि क्या करेंगे?
horrendous
रोहित को क्या लाके करेंगे? कोहली को तो फिर भी ले आए।
अगर
कैप्टन
रोहित
उसे बना दिया, एक तो लाना पड़ेगा ना अब।
वही ना, रोहित तो कैप्टन है।
really happened, which you've now heard.
वो भी दिक्कत हुई। रहाणे को नहीं लिया ना इस बार टेस्ट में।
Restoring
रहाणे को नहीं, टेस्ट में तो नहीं लिया मगर T20 में ले
It's
लिया।
about showing Mr. Depp's children.
गलत लिया ना उसको, टेस्ट
T20
में लेना
में
चाहिए
है।
था, T20 में नहीं लेना था उसे।
अबे
क्या
रहाणे ने इस बार इतना खेला भी कहाँ है, और केकेआर में था ना रहाणे तो।
नहीं रहाणे नहीं, सॉरी मैं डीके की बात कर रहा हूँ, डीके की बात कर रहा हूँ।
Restoring Mr. Depp's name.
रहाणे तो कहीं पे भी नहीं है, रहाणे तो हर जगह से हट गया भाई।
And you can do so.
अरे पुजारा की फॉर्म ठीक हो गई, देखा था तुमने? काउंटी क्रिकेट में भी बहुत सही मारे हैं
वो
रन उसने।
उसमें ठीक हो रही है अभी देख।
100
भाई इंटरनेशनल ही होता है भाई, कुछ पता
उसके साथ भी
नहीं।
तो यही हुआ ना, कुछ
यार,
ज्यादा ही
वो
कंपेयर
तो है
उसे
ही।
भी उसे भी द्रविड़ से इतना कंपेयर करने लग गए, उसकी भी पूरी फॉर्म खराब हो गई।
भाई वो कितना सही चल रहा था अपना, पर उसका भी मतलब कभी तो बैड फेज आना ही था भाई। ये थोड़ा ना मैं
अरे वो तो ठीक है, लेकिन इतना भी खराब, इतना ज्यादा खराब हो गया भाई कि टीम में
सबसे ज्यादा तो कोहली का चल रहा है भाई।
इसकी तो पता नहीं क्या भाई। 8 साल से ज्यादा जूनियर उससे ही इतना ज्यादा अच्छी फॉर्म रही है, इसकी अभी 2 साल में ही खराब हुई है कोविड में। 2019 में तो लास्ट दिसंबर में तो वो मारी है सेंचुरी। 2020 में फिर शुरू में खेला नहीं, जब कोविड वगैरह का वो हो गया, उसके बाद तो पता नहीं क्या ही बैठी है इसकी फॉर्म।
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and take a break at this time. Again,
भाई ये क्या
this
चेक
case has
करते हैं,
not been
मुझे तो
submitted to
समझ
you
नहीं आ
yet. We will
रहा।
continue
इतने
to close
पास से भी
arguments
नहीं
when we
गई,
come back, so
इन
do not
कॉल्स
discuss
में
the case
गैप
with
दिखता है
yourselves.
काफी बार,
Don't do the outside
ऐसे करना
research,
पड़
okay?
जाता है इन लोगों को।
रहाणे है, टेस्ट टीम में है रहाणे।
बहुत बढ़िया इम्पैक्ट आउटसाइड है। इनका रिव्यू वेस्ट हो गया। अब रिव्यू आराम, अभी थोड़ा सोच समझ के ले लेंगे। एक रिव्यू बचता है तो वैसे ना एक रिव्यू का सिस्टम अच्छा है इनके लिए आईपीएल में, तो उससे ही ज्यादा वो रहते हैं।
Let's come back at 11:05.
नहीं तो 2 रिव्यूज में कितने बाहर ले लेते हैं ये लोग। सस्पेंस भी बना रहता है और आईपीएल में मजा भी तभी आता है जब एक रहे।
अरे मैं सोच रहा हूँ एक विंडो ना उसकी भी खोल लेता हूँ।
हॉटस्टार की दो दो साउंड आएंगी, फिर म्यूट कर लेना
नहीं,
हॉटस्टार।
एक ही हॉटस्टार म्यूट कर दूंगा ना बस।
और उस स्ट्रीम को इसमें मत डाल देना, क्योंकि ये स्ट्रीम भी वो कर आ दोगे फिर कॉपीराइट।
सीधी कॉपीराइट आएगी इसकी।
म्यूट करने पे भी आएगी।
हाँ, कॉपीराइट आ
हाँ
जाएगा।
हाँ, कॉपीराइट आएगा भाई।
क्योंकि हॉटस्टार का
कंप्लीट हो गया
वो है
क्या
ना।
ट्रायल?
नहीं, ब्रेक है, ब्रेक।
अच्छा, ब्रेक है। हॉटस्टार वालों ने भाई वहां तक उस पे लगा दिया था, वो जो लोग ट्विच पे कर रहे थे स्ट्रीम।
भाई ये
नियमित कई बार देखता
मगर
था
ये
ट्विच
सोचो
पे जाके।
मेरे को तो ये लग रहा है इस जज को, जो इनके ट्रायल को जज कर रही है, इसको कितना भाई, कितने चीजें देखनी पड़ेंगी, कितनी चीजें मतलब दोबारा सुननी पड़ेंगी एक डिसीजन के लिए।
वो तो है ही भाई, वो तो सारे जजेस के लिए ऐसा ही होता है
भाई मगर ये केस तो कुछ ज्यादा ही डीप और पता नहीं किस लेवल पे वो है, और सबसे बड़ा केस होगा इसकी जिंदगी का भाई, इन लॉयर्स की भी और इस जज की भी केस जिंदगी का सबसे बड़ा केस होगा।
मे बी
क्या भाई, 100
लेकिन
मिलियन का केस
पब्लिक,
है भाई।
अबे पब्लिक लाइमलाइट है भाई, इसलिए ज्यादा और बड़ा
तो
है।
वही तो
नहीं तो
सारे
अगर
डिसीजन पे
बिजनेस पर्सपेक्टिव, अरे
बैकलैश आएगा
बिजनेस
ना।
पर्सपेक्टिव से भी अगर हो ना तो भी हो सकता है इतना बड़ा, उसमें कोई ऐसी बात नहीं है।
हम्म।
बट वही है, सारे लॉयर्स अलग अलग एक्सपर्टीज के होते हैं ना, वो उस हिसाब से केसेस उठाते हैं।
वो तो है ही, सूट्स देख के इतना तो सीख ही चुके हैं।
तुम दोनों ने देख रखा है पूरा पूरा?
पूरा नहीं यार,
क्या?
मैंने लास्ट के 2 सीजन नहीं देखे हैं सूट्स के, बाकी देखा हुआ है पूरा।
कौन सा?
सूट्स।
ये क्या है?
देख भाई को तो पता भी नहीं है।
नहीं देखा है इसको।
मेरे को आवाज, अच्छा इसमें इन्होंने म्यूट कर दी की आवाज ट्रायल वालों ने। चलो फिर इनका ब्रेक चल रहा है तो हम भी अपना ब्रेक ले लेते हैं, तब तक इंटरमिशन कर देता हूँ।
said enough. Enough. And we're asking you to finally hold this man responsible. He has never accepted responsibility for anything in his life. You've heard it this whole time. He hasn't admitted to anything. He's blamed everybody in the world, his agent, his manager, his lawyer, Amber, his friends, everybody. But he's never accepted responsibility for a thing he's done in his life. But we're asking you to accept, to make him accept responsibility, to hold him legally responsible for his actions, and to fully and fairly compensate Amber for what he has done by creating this concept of a hoax for the defamation that he has committed, that you have heard so much about, that just took wildfire and went off into negative media and has made Amber's life pure hell up to this day. We're asking you to do that, to compensate her, to be fair and hold him responsible so he stops. We don't want another lawsuit. We don't want anything else. We want to leave Amber alone and let her get on with her life and raise her child. So let's talk about the counterclaim for a moment. These are Adam Waldman's statements. You've heard Mr. Depp say, well, why aren't you suing Mr. Waldman? Isn't that typical of Mr. Depp? He doesn't take responsibility for anything, so now he's going to blame his lawyer. But the evidence is very clear on all three statements, and we'll show them to you in a minute, that he says Adam Waldman, Mr. Depp's attorney, says these things. Now, Mr. Depp says, oh, I didn't even know about those until the counterclaim. Well, we know that's not true because Mr. Waldman's testimony was 2 months before those statements were made. In February of 2020, Mr. Depp accompanied Mr. Waldman to the Daily Mail, the same place that all three of these statements were published, and he gave him 2 spliced audio tapes to try to make it look like Amber was the person who was committing the abuse. He went with him. He knew that Mr. Waldman was doing this. He knew that Mr. Waldman was launching a campaign against Amber to try to discredit her. And the timing of this, we're talking, the statements now are April and June of 2020. The trial is July of 2020. So they're launching an attack to try to discredit Amber before the trial in the UK. That's what happened here. And that is Mr. Waldman, but it's Mr. Depp. The judge gave you 3 different instructions, and you'll all have them. He's acting as his attorney. He has the authority. So Mr. Depp is standing in the shoes of Mr. Waldman. Mr. Waldman is standing in the shoes of Mr. Depp. Michelle, can you please bring up the first statement? It says, Amber and her friends in the media use fake sexual violence allegations as both a sword and shield, depending on their needs. They have selected some of her sexual violence hoax facts as the sword, inflicting them on the public and Mr. Depp. Now, what this statement is meant to imply is that Amber is lying about the sexual assaults and using them with the media to try to discredit Mr. Depp. That's the clear implications of this. Now, the first part of this is this contradicts Mr. Depp's claims today that the first time you ever heard about the sexual assaults that happened was in this case. It was in the UK case. This is the case that Mr. Depp brought in the UK. And instead of Amber Heard trying to put this out in the media, she did exactly the opposite. Now, this article's not in your evidence book. At least some of you will remember it being shown at one point with the title that said that Amber was successful in being able to treat her allegations of the sexual violence confidential in that proceeding. And it was treated confidential. She did exactly the opposite. She didn't want to tell people this. And you know that. You watched her on the stand. It was heart-rending for her to have to do this with the cameras, no less. But what else is false about this statement? It's that there was no false statements of sexual violence. Ben went through all 4 of them, and I will not repeat them all. You heard the testimony, and interestingly enough, you didn't hear any stories that differed from that with Mr. Depp. He didn't get on the stand and say no, this didn't happen, to at least a couple of them. And he can't in Australia. He can't remember anything, likely. But if you just look at the pictures of the destruction in that house, I mean, imagine painting those canvases and how long that took and how much hatred and rage you have to have for somebody to do something like that. Writing on the walls, tearing up her nightgown and wrapping pieces of raw steak and putting it all over the house. Remember that she also testified that he took her clothes and swiped them through all the paint before she left. These things happened. With respect to the malice on this one, he knows that he did these things. That he knows he was out of it for 3 days. And that's all that we need to prove for malice. But there's a couple of more facts here. But you can find whatever Mr. Waldman's done, and you can find whatever Mr. Depp has done. And both of those are the same for purposes of evaluating the verdict form. They stand in each other's shoes. When you have an agent, and that's what the jury instructions say, you can go with both. What did Mr. Waldman do? There was an article about the sexual violence that he had put from the April one that went into the trial. Amber's testimony, she was sitting near him in the trial. Adam Waldman threw that newspaper down in front of her defiantly. That's actual malice. And she was quite upset, and you heard her testimony on the stand about that. He was just inflicting it on her. Remember Bruce Witkin's testimony. This was Johnny Depp's best friend for 40 years until he testified truthfully 4 years ago about the drugs and alcohol, and he stopped talking to him. There was a couple of really important things that Bruce Witkin said. One of the things he said, he met Adam Waldman once. Adam Waldman said, "Do you have any dirt on the Mandels?" And he said no, and that was it. Then he didn't care. He is an attack dog. All he wants to do is attack and put dirt on people. The second thing that Witkin said that I think was pretty instructive was that Johnny Depp has deep-seated anger issues that have nothing to do with Amber. He remembered even back when Johnny was married to his sister-in-law, he had extreme jealousy even back then. And I think that's pretty significant. Remember, Mr. Witkin also was called in a few times to intercede in some of these fights between Johnny and Amber when he would become so angry. The last thing I thought he said that was actually pretty important was that Kipper and his whole group are a scam. He said, how is it that they can be sober doctors, for these years, and he's never sober. He's even taking pot all the time. How can you be sober? I thought that was quite instructive. But in any event, going back to, that's the first statement. The second statement, Michelle, if you can bring that one up. Oh, before I go there, I want to talk about a few more things from Mr. Waldman that you have in your pocket to be able to find additional malice with him. Remember, he's the one that after the UK trial went to the LAPD with a notebook full of things and tried to get perjury charges against Amber. The LAPD said, we don't investigate those things. But he then went to a German newspaper and said, Amber is being investigated by the NYPD or the LAPD for perjury. Do you remember that? That's malice. That's showing his intent to do harm to Amber. He also admitted that he speaks to that umbrella guy, and you'll see that one text in there from the person from TMZ. That umbrella guy is the big lead of Johnny Depp's, positive social media that is putting all the negative out on Amber Heard. And he also ended up getting knocked out of Twitter because he was abusing Amber. So now we'll go to the second counterclaim statement. And that is quite simply, this was an ambush, a hoax. They set Mr. Depp up by calling the cops, but the first attempts didn't do the trick. The officers came to the penthouses, thoroughly searched and interviewed, and left after seeing no damage to face or property. So Amber and her friends spilled a little wine, roughed the place up, got their story straight under the direction of a lawyer and publicist, then placed a second call to 911. Now this is May 21. Now, the clear implication here is that they're saying that Amber got together with her friends. They decided they were going to set Johnny up to be charged for domestic violence. And so they called the police, and they tried to make up this whole story, get him arrested, but the police said there's no evidence here. and went away, and they said, darn. And so they spilled wine, and they, busted up the place, and they called 911. They got advice from a lawyer and a publicist, called 911, and tried again to get Johnny charged. That's what this says. Now, we all know that's false, and it's heinously false. Because, after these events happened, and Ben talked about a little bit of it, but I'll talk about the rest of it, and I'm going to try to do it really quickly. But we all know Amber did everything in her power not to tell them who Johnny was, not to press charges, not to have him arrested. The exact opposite of this. But what were the facts of May 21st? He comes over. He's already been drinking. He's already high. And he is on a tear about feces in the bed from a month ago. And remember how Amber talked about when he gets into these drug-induced things, he gets into these paranoias, and he gets some idea in his head, and he just won't let it go. And that was his this time. There's somebody put that feces in the bed a month ago. That was his spin. So she gets Io Tillett on the phone. He's in New York at the time. He's going, they thought, this is ridiculous. Of course nobody did. And by the way, Boo has this huge problem. Of course it was Boo. He's always doing this. But Johnny just won't get there. So then they laugh. That makes him mad. Then he throws the phone at Amber. Amber screams out and says, ow, you just threw the cell phone at me. It hurts. Io says, Amber, get out of there. Johnny gets madder, pulls her hair, grabs her and starts hitting her. So Io gets hold of Rocky Pennington. She comes over as quickly as she can. She goes and gets in between the two of them. She puts her hands up on his chest. He pushes them down. And then she continues to stand in between them. And he's screaming loudly 10 times, Amber, get the fuck up. Amber, get the fuck up. Amber, get the fuck up. Loudly, loudly. Then his bodyguards hear this. They come in. They break it up. That's how that happens. But the next part of this, remember Josh Drew, and I think Elizabeth Mars was amazing in this one. Remember their testimony. After that, he goes and he has to, he always leaves a path of destruction as he's leaving. So he, bashes up things, and you saw Ben's pictures here on the picture frames, knocks things over as he's going, goes down the hallway, he's splashing the wine, he gets his bodyguards to let him into penthouse 5. That's where Josh and Elizabeth are trying to help with Rocky's bead thing for the next day, and he comes in, storming in, and he says, get your bitch out of here, and he's got the big magnum, and he's mad, and Elizabeth is just terrified. She barely knows Johnny. She's met him 4 times, and she goes ripping out of there as fast as she can, and Josh gets out of there too. Then what does he do? He rearranges the furniture, or he might have knocked something off, one of the countertops or something. I think is the testimony of his bodyguards. But you saw the pictures. He went through and trashed that place again as he left. Now, the next part of this is the police coming. Io calls the police. He's in New York. He calls the New York Police 911. He's afraid they're not going to get there fast enough. He still remembers December 15 because he came in afterwards and saw all of the injuries on Amber and all the evidence. And he's terrified that Amber's still in there, the police haven't come, and that Johnny's going to kill her. So he calls a friend in LA and says, please call 911. We got to get somebody there fast. So she calls 911. So we have 2 calls, and you'll see the call summary. And the call summary shows those 2 calls really close in proximity here. So it's not them, we didn't get the first police officer, so we'll rough up the place and make a second one. You'll see that they're like 8 minutes apart up there. But it took 2 hours to dispatch the 2 different ones, and Amber never even had any idea that the second one was coming. The first one's come. And, we've talked about it. We've shown you the pictures. The police officers admitted that those pictures could very much have been what was there that night. Remember, Officer Haddon, it was his first week on the job. Officer Science was three years on the job at that point. They say, they told Josh that if she will press charges, if she'll give a name, we can file a report and make an arrest. She wouldn't do it. You did hear from Detective Sandanaga. That's the domestic violence. You recall Josh Drew saying that the police officer told him, she'll give a name, we'll make an arrest. He definitely said that. But in any event, she would not cooperate. She didn't want to. But Detective Sandanaga, their domestic relations or domestic violence person, said they should have done an incident report no matter what, even if they decided there wasn't a crime. Because domestic violence has the cycles, they come back, and it's good to have the record for the next time that it might happen. So she said they should have under the circumstances, even if they didn't. And she also said that when they put verbal dispute only in those calls, it is a code that they use, and you'll see that it's twice on that call report. So to say that's why we didn't write a report. But in any event, whether the police officers, forgot about it 2 months later when they were first asked about it, whether they just decided she's never going to press charges, and you'll see on the call report they're insisting that to the second set, it doesn't make any difference. The point is, this is still false. This statement is still false because Amber did everything but try to press charges against Johnny Depp. So they go away. And the testimony is that Josh and Amber and Rocky cleaned up because they have dogs, so they cleaned up a lot of the glass and the wine and those types. They had no idea the second police officers were coming by, and they certainly didn't call them, and they certainly didn't talk. They never talked to a publicist. She did talk to a lawyer who gave her advice, and that's why she wouldn't tell them, anything. She said, "I'm not going to cooperate at all." So the second one's coming. You saw that. You've got the video cameras in there, and you see there's no effort by them to try to get now these officers to press charges against Johnny Depp. Just the opposite. Josh Drew doesn't want to even let him in the place. They come through quickly. Everything's fine. They wave. Everything's fine. Are they trying to press charges against Johnny? No. They're not trying to do anything. They're trying to get him out of there, which makes this statement 100% false. Was it made with malice? Absolutely. There's nobody that thinks that Amber tried to press charges that night. Johnny knew that. But the other thing that's very helpful and what you should look at is Defendants Exhibits 772 and 773. Because once again, the next day, Johnny apologizes to Amber. He says in two different text messages, that's 772 and 773, he says, "My profound apologies" in one of them, and "my apologies are eternal" in the other one. What is he apologizing for the next day on May 22nd if he didn't know that he did all of those things? And by the way, remember Isaac Baruch even remembers the wine in the hallway. None of the police officers remember the wine. And that's because they're busy and they got a zillion other things going, and they didn't remember this call 2 months later when they were asked about it. So that's the next one. So clearly that's 100% false. Clearly they knew it. Clearly there's malice in making that statement. They're trying to suggest that she's manufacturing evidence with her friends to try to frame Mr. Depp. Nothing could be further from the truth on that one. And she did not want those police officers to press charges. Now let's go to the third one. Oh, and let's talk about the makeup just for a moment while we're going to the third one. This makeup thing, fresh-faced, natural. These were Adam Waldman planting these when he talked to the ECB people. Remember the testimony here. We kept asking, so did you talk to Mr. Waldman? Did you talk to Mr. Waldman? Mr. Waldman was trying to plant in all of these people's minds.
Objection, Your Honor.
Somehow she wasn't.
Did you approach?
So I didn't say that any of the witnesses admitted that Adam Waldman planted that. I'm saying he planted it. That's me arguing the planting. And that's because it's all the same thing. She wasn't wearing any makeup. She was natural. She wasn't wearing a stitch of makeup. Every one of them says it. It's the exact same thing. Well, why would you say that? She's an actor. She's not going to go outside her house without putting makeup on. And if she has bruises, why on earth, when she's been covering them up for 4 years, why on earth would she not put makeup on so that she would cover those up? Why on earth would she not want to cover up those bruises? It makes no sense. But you know what? You guys saw her here. You saw Amber on the stand. There were days where she didn't wear eye makeup. A lot of people think that she's not wearing makeup when she doesn't have mascara and eyeliner on. She has different looks, and some of them are with eye makeup and some of them are without. And people misunderstand, especially people that aren't that good at makeup, and a lot of men, frankly, go, oh, then she probably doesn't have makeup. And that's where that mistake happens. But you heard her testimony, and you heard her makeup artist testimony saying she doesn't go out of her room without concealer and foundation. She knows how to put these things in. And you saw Defendant's Exhibit 155, and you'll have the actual thing in there. That's the type of palette she used, and she was very adept at telling you what colors she puts on for the different days of bruises. This is a woman who for 4 years did everything she could to cover up anybody knowing anything about this abuse. Do you honestly think she's just going to walk around for the week with her bruises exposed? Of course she's not. Now, let's go to the third one. And this is the abuse hoax. He says, we've reached the beginning of the end of Ms. Heard's abuse hoax against Johnny Depp. Now, obviously the defamatory meaning of that is that Amber's creating an abuse hoax. But there is no abuse hoax. I don't need to tell you all of the evidence because Ben did a beautiful job of just taking you through all of those different things, but I will point out a couple things for you. And that is, remember Bonnie Jacobs, the therapist. Dr. Hughes and Dr. Spiegel testified about Bonnie Jacobs' notes. And remember that I was holding that, you don't get to see them, but they testified that they went through them. Dr. Hughes testified that she also spoke with Bonnie Jacobs. She kept contemporaneous notes from 2011 when she first started seeing Amber. And the abuse is documented in those notes, is what Dr. Hughes testified to. They start in 2012, both physical and sexual.
Objection, Your Honor.
That Dr. Hughes testified to that. So Dr. Hughes specifically characterized Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes as reflecting both contemporaneous physical abuse and sexual abuse throughout that time period. Dr. Spiegel confirmed that later and said the same. When I asked Dr. Curry if she had reviewed those notes, she said yes, but she had no comment and she
Your Honor,
did not
objection.
that that was in there. confirmed that he had reviewed Bonnie Jacobs' notes as well. And when I asked Dr. Curry, she said she had reviewed them, but she had no comment, but she also didn't deny that those were in there. Amber Heard testified that she went back, and because of Bonnie Jacobs' notes, she realized for the first time that the abuse started much earlier than she even realized before. She always had thought that it had started in 2013. When she went back and saw Bonnie Jacobs' notes, she realized that it had started much earlier, and she was very embarrassed by that. Now, significantly, you remember that she testified about how she was first called upon to actually detail all of her events of abuse in February of this year. And she went through and took the notes, took photos, she took everything she had, calendars, everything, put it all together, and you heard about at least 64 pages of detailed accountability of that. And Mr. Depp's team has been able to not refute any of that. Remember, they tried to impeach her and say, well, you didn't say that. She said, yes, I did, on page 64. Remember that? It was a very, very difficult process for her because there was an awful lot of it, and she put it in great detail. Now, let's talk for a moment about the motive. They have said that she has created this whole hoax, and I think Ben's done a nice job of showing how that can't possibly have been. But what would Amber Heard's motive be for creating a hoax, or creating any of this, or making any of this up? That's a big question here. They call her a gold digger, right? But she obviously couldn't have done it for the money, because first of all, remember the testimony of Laura Wasser, the divorce attorney. She said that California is a no-fault state and community property. So Amber doesn't have to have an abuse. She could have divorced him for irreconcilable differences, for abandonment, for adultery, for anything. She doesn't need an excuse. And she gets 50% of whatever he earns during the time of the marriage, unless they had a prenup or a postnup. The testimony from Michelle Mulrooney was that Amber completely cooperated with the prenup and the postnup, but it was Johnny Depp who, and you already heard from Ben, called her up and fired her. He didn't want a postnup or a prenup. So she's entitled to 50% of everything he earns during that time. Now we have Plaintiff's Exhibit 936 in evidence, and look at page 69. It says how much he made in 2015. It was $43 million. Remember Mr. Spindler, Depp's expert, who said that he made $22 million in 2016. So you got $65 million. Amber was entitled to 31.5 at least. That doesn't include all the back ends from, for example, Pirates 5. She was entitled to that money. So she didn't need to say anything. She could have just said, I don't like you anymore. I don't like the color of your hair. I'm going to divorce you.
Your Honor, we're going to object again.
So if you do the math, Amber is entitled to at least 31.5. What does she take? $7 million. What does she do with the $7 million? She gives it to charity, or she intends to give it to charity. Now, they make much ado about the pledge versus donation, but both the corporate designees for ACLU and for Children's Hospital said donation and pledge are interchangeable. You know, these are pledges. The ACLU corporate designee said you typically do pledges because of the tax benefits, and that's what she said. She pledged it over a period of time because of the tax implications to it and because she was getting paid over the time. Now, she started to make these donations, and you'll see that the first one was on behalf of Mr. Depp's business manager, Mr. White, actually sent the letters with the $100,000 for each of those. That was the initial ones. He was trying to take credit for those, and in fact, both the ACLU and Children's Hospital got confused and gave the credit to Mr. Depp, not to Amber, for those. Then she made payments to both, and Elon Musk also made payments to both for $500,000 each, which she didn't count to her pledge, but they helped those organizations. At the end of the day, she's made $1 million in payments to them, but then she got sued here and hasn't been able to because she spent $6 million in attorney's fees. That is unrefuted. She still intends to pay those pledges, honor those pledges, and she said that throughout, and I elicited from both the ACLU and from Children's Hospital, they haven't expired, she can pay them whenever she wants to, and she fully intends to, but she has to get out from under this first. Now, who would blame a woman for giving $1 million in charitable donations? Who would do that? That sounds like psychological abuse to me. Now, Mr. Mandel testified that Johnny Depp is not a charitable person, and he hasn't written any big checks for him. Mr. Depp got on the stand and says he does it anonymously, but Mr. Mandel would have been the one writing the checks, and he says that didn't happen. Now let's go to damages, because I promised you I was going to go pretty fast here. There's a few different types of damages, but one of the things that the court has talked to you about, she told you that because we have defamation, it's invidious, and therefore it's very difficult to prove these. And so these damages to business reputation, inconvenience, embarrassment are presumed. You don't have to prove those damages. And one great example of that is the testimony from Mr. Hamada at Warner Brothers. He didn't want to have to get in the middle of all of this with Aquaman 2. They haven't even released it. So he didn't read anything in preparation for his deposition. He didn't talk to anybody before his deposition. He said that he tried to do technicals and say, no, we never terminated her contract, but oh yeah, we did tell her we were probably not going to renew her option. And then we didn't change the script, but Amber got the script, and yes, they did change it. Then he said, no, we never negotiate salaries, but oh yeah, we did renegotiate Jason Momoa's and Gal Gadot's. So he just doesn't want to admit to any of these things. But what came out in Hamada's deposition, and I hope you were listening carefully to this, was the email from James Wan, the director, and Jason Momoa, her co-star, who said they guarantee if they are in the film, she is going to be Mara in the film. Why would they do that unless they thought Warner Brothers was being unfair to her? And why did she get almost knocked out of it? Because of the defamatory statements. When they came out, they took on a life of their own. Ron Schnell, the young Sheldon, I call him the Doogie Howser, our expert on IT, took you through and tracked how they tracked the defamatory statements, the language from the defamatory statements, how that went through the social media and the negative social media. And it kept going and kept going. And he tracked all the way until a few months ago over 2.36 million negative tweets, negative Instagrams, negative social media's comments about Amber that relate specifically to the information that was in those 3 defamatory statements. It took on a life of its own. They started to get Amber fired from Aquaman 2. They have continued to this day. They have followed her everywhere. Everybody has stopped wanting her. L'Oreal won't use her, even though they've kept her on from that time. She lost 3 different opportunities that were being discussed with her. The most significant part of that, though, is that Aquaman was the biggest blockbuster ever for DC Films. It was the biggest. It was over $1 billion. This was her opportunity for her star. Even the experts from Mr. Depp admitted this was her blockbuster, this was her mega. But what happened instead? As she's going through, as it's coming out, and in that 16 months they were going, well, nothing happened. Yeah, lots happened. She had 3 different films she was discussing. She got the L'Oreal contract. She got The Stand. All of those things were happening because of Aquaman. And then everything shut down. She wasn't allowed to do publicity for The Stand. She wasn't allowed to, she hasn't been allowed to do anything for L'Oreal. She got shut down from her charitable organizations. She ended up not getting the Amazon movie. And then they gave her a hard time about Aquaman 2. And instead of the career trajectory of the other comparators, who all went way up, and by the way, all the experts admit that career trajectory went well for all the rest of them, and she's the only one that didn't have it. And the reason is because of the defamatory statements. So you have some very good information to help you on ascertaining those damages. Now, Jessica Kovacevic, and I don't know if you remember her, but she was her agent. She said, everybody just stop talking. The producers don't want her, the directors don't want her, nobody wants her. We just can't get the traction, and we should have been able to get the traction, and they say it's because of those statements. So Catherine Arnold gave you some good estimates on this, and she gave you a very good basis for it. And she didn't use Jason Momoa's or Gal Gadot's or the others. She used Amber's, but used those comparators to show that they got big movies, that they got commercial opportunities, that they got these TV opportunities. But she used the base that Amber had. So she used the $4 million from the Aquaman, that would be 3. She used the stands, how much they got paid per movie. And what she estimated on those, and she went through those details, is that if you took that for the last 2 years and projected into the next 3 to 4, that it's between $47 and $50 million that she could have had, instead of her star being completely extinguished. And that's what's happened to her. The emotional distress damages are even more extreme here. And that is, Don Hughes testified extensively about the PTSD and what she goes through. And every time she's called a liar, every time these hoax things come up, everything, it causes her to relive all of it. She talks about the panic attacks, the nervousness, the intrusive thoughts, the nightmares, all of the sweats, the anxiety that goes through all of this. It's significant, but probably the most compelling testimony that you could ever hear was from Amber yesterday, and when she took the stand before. It has destroyed her life. This has consumed her. She's getting death threats. Her daughter, they're threatening to put her daughter in a microwave, for God's sakes. She can't get away from this. It's everywhere. This media, the social media that has just taken off, has just consumed her life. As she said, I'm a human being. No human being should be put through this. Now, Johnny Depp sued for $100 million or for $50 million, and we sent a message back saying, fine, then we're going to sue for $100 million because look at what you've done to her. We're not asking you to give $100 million. We're asking you to just look at the damages in this case and just be fair and reasonable in whatever you determine by following the evidence and the instructions. But we do ask that you fully and fairly compensate Amber for everything that she's been through, both in terms of reputation and emotional distress. The very last point is punitive damages, and you surely have those in this case. We've asked for $350,000 for the punitive damages, and we would ask that you award that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to do, we still have rebuttal closing arguments, but I can guarantee you that the rebuttal closing arguments will be done combined within 45 minutes. But what I want to do is go ahead and let you have your lunch. And then after lunch, we'll come back in the courtroom, have the rebuttal closing arguments, and then we'll submit the case to you, okay? All right, so go ahead and have your lunch. Do not discuss the case with each other, and do not do any outside research, okay? So let's come back at 2:10, and just for the record, plaintiffs have 39 minutes left for rebuttal. Defendants have 6 minutes. Okay. I didn't take any time off from the sidebars, 0 off from the sidebars. It's all from testimony, okay? All right, thank you. All right.
More than just physical. He talked about the words and emotional abuse and not wanting her to go forward with her career, and that's another form of abuse. I think basically saying, you tell me, you know, when she's given this editorial or writing this opinion piece, she could be referring to those things as well.
Exactly. I think for Amber Heard's legal team, their strongest argument is to say that she was abused emotionally and psychologically because there's no evidence other than Amber Heard's statement testifying that she was physically abused. But the jury can infer psychological and emotional abuse, and we can see that Rottenborn actually focused on that in his closing. But like you mentioned, the court of public opinion is different. So there is that legal side being tracked here, and there's the court of public opinion. And you're right, 100% agree that the moment he walked on that stand and testified, and the moment he got off, he already won because he was able to speak his truth. And we saw in rebuttal that he repeated that, I only wanted to tell the truth. And we see in Ben Chu's closing, he ended with an emotional statement saying the truth matters. And we saw and heard him almost choking, trying to get that out. And you can feel Ben Chu's emotion for his client.
Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing case, and if you want to add any more of the craziness to the case, there's tornado warnings out there. The weather is inclement. As you know, at the Law Crime Network, we've had our very own Jesse Weber. I can kind of see him in the corner of my eye and a monitor there, and I also see my good friend Gene Rossi getting ready to tee up your questions when we come back from the break. As you know, we're taking questions from the audience. They've been amazing, and our guests will be answering those questions, including Mr. Rossi, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Welcome to a very special For the Record, everybody. I am Jesse Weber. We are here in Fairfax County, Virginia. I'm here with Gene Rossi. And by the way, you know, I should have needed a booster seat. I didn't realize this height differential when we're sitting. But we're right now not in front of the courthouse due to thunderstorms in the area. In fact, there was an Amber Alert that popped up in the middle of closing arguments. But that's what's happening right now. We are reporting live to you. That trial will be back soon. They're currently on a lunch break. We're live in the closing arguments for the Johnny Depp Amber Heard defamation trial. And during this lunch break, this is when we take your questions on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, email. Send your questions in, and we will answer them today. I'm not only here with the esteemed law and crime legal analyst Gene Rossi, I'm also here with law and crime legal analyst Dina Dahl, as well as trial attorney Catherine Lizardo. It's great to have everybody here. I'll start off with some questions. First up, we have from Leon1 Shrike on YouTube. How long is this break for? Till 2:10 Eastern. That's when we think that the lunch break will be over and the jury will come back in. Gene, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
This is from Stressed Potato on YouTube. Let's Stressed Potato. During closing arguments, why hadn't Johnny's lawyers play Amber's testimony from yesterday admitting to writing the op-ed about Johnny for the jury?
You know, I don't know why they didn't do that. I think that's a very good point to counter the argument that was coming out from Mr. Rottenborn, that article really was a global comment about domestic abuse, and it really wasn't designed to affect his reputation, because that's what they got to show. It was designed to hurt and harm Johnny Depp. I don't know why they didn't play that. That's a very good question.
Yeah, because a lot of our viewers were saying that was a little bit of a slip-up from Amber Heard. And talking about again, we are going to take all your questions this hour, but to give you a sense of what you might have missed, here's a portion of Johnny Depp's his closing argument from earlier this morning. Take a look.
The mountain of evidence that Mr. Depp abused Ms. Heard is simply not there. What we have is a mountain of unproven allegations that are wild, over the top, and implausible. And you can't pick and choose which of these wild allegations to believe and which ones to disregard. You either believe all of it or none of it. Either Mr. Depp sexually assaulted Ms. Heard with a bottle in Australia, or Ms. Heard got up on that stand in front of all of you and made up that horrific tale of abuse. Either she's a victim of truly horrific abuse, or she is a woman who is willing to say absolutely anything. It is disturbing to think that Ms. Heard would make up the horrific tales of abuse that she testified to in this courtroom. But this case doesn't come down to whether you believe Ms. Heard or you believe Mr. Depp. This case comes down to whether you believe Ms. Heard or you believe Mr. Depp, Christy Dombrowski, Sean Bett, Malcolm Connolly, Travis McGivern, Starling Jenkins, Keenan Wyatt, Dr. Kipper, nurses Debbie Lloyd and Aaron Filati, Tara Roberts, Ben King, Kate James, Kate Moss, Dr. Colber, Morgan Knight, Morgan Tremaine, Officers Melissa Sines, Officers Tyler Haddon, Officer William Gatlin, and Beverly Leonard. What Ms. Heard testified to in this courtroom is the story of far too many women. But the overwhelming evidence and weight of that evidence shows that it is not her story. It's not Ms. Heard's story.
Okay, a powerful moment there from Camille Vasquez saying you have to believe that Amber Heard is telling the truth and everyone else is not telling the truth. We're getting more of your questions right now on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, however you want to send them in. I have a question from Tammy Japink from YouTube. Did the judge just tell Amber's team that they only had 6 minutes left? That is correct. So there are time limits here for these closing arguments. Amber's team only has 6 minutes left for a rebuttal closing argument. Johnny Depp's team, 39 minutes. That's exactly how we know how much longer these closing arguments are going to go before deliberations begin. Okay, Catherine Lizardo, I have a question for you from Declan Cooley on Facebook. Did Amber's team deliberately misuse the term malice to mean maliciousness? Isn't that trying to mislead the jury?
Exactly. I caught on that, and we were talking about that during the break, that when Ellen Redehoff actually used malice to show sinister, that's not what actual malice is in this case, because we're talking about defamation. Remember that Johnny Depp and Amber Heard are public figures. That's why the element of actual malice is included in the jury instructions. But actual malice means that you made the statement false, and knowing that it's so false and with such reckless disregard that it's tantamount to willful disregard of truth. But when she used it in her closing, she said, that Waldman, when he threw the paper at Amber Heard, that's malice, that's sinister. That's not what malice is. And you can see Camille and Ben Chu talking and trying to figure out, are we going to object here or not? Maybe we'll hear that in the rebuttal. And they should put that in their rebuttal.
They really should. That's such an important term. That's really the whole case. That's why when we talk about defamation, that actual malice standard is so important for the jury to understand the definition, and it's a really high definition. It's a really high standard. Okay, so now I'm going to go to you, Dina. We have a question from one of our Twitch followers, Corporal Roll Mops. What do they object to in a closing argument? I read somewhere that this can be seen as unprofessional. So do you think Johnny Depp's side looks bad since they objected a lot more?
I think that Elaine was doing a fantastic job. And I say that as somebody who I think that Amber Heard was probably going to lose her case because of how many inconsistencies she has. But the way she had the facts and the legal arguments, and I think Johnny Depp's team realized that. And they were trying to make sure that if she said anything, it was, really held to a high standard. But that could have really backfired because the jury wants to hear this. This is their last chance to kind of hear an uninterrupted version of events, and it makes it look like they have to. It looks a little bit desperate, I think, the number of times they objected to her.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, Gene, I'll throw another question. Sure. One of our followers from Mexico, this is somebody who tweeted us. This is from @AmazingAndy. Amazing Andy. I thought you couldn't object on closing arguments. Why did Johnny Depp's attorneys do it? Ola from Mexico.
I was just in Mazatlan. There's two reasons why you object. One, the attorney for the other side is misstating the law. The other reason is they're misstating facts, grossly misstating facts. And there's actually a third reason, which is nefarious. An attorney is doing it to put the other side off stride.
हाँ, तू ही नहीं बोल रहा था, मैं तो 2-4 मिनट पहले आ गया था, पता नहीं कहाँ जा रखा था। अच्छा, मेरे को 2 मिनट थे, मैंने गेम खोल लिया वैसे, ठीक है। आरसीबी तो गई भाई। 16 में 8 चाहिए भाई, बटलर तो मार ही देगा 100।
आराम से लग रहा है, लग जाएगी। 5 रन
4 रन चाहिए, 4 चाहिए।
अरे
क्या
हेलो
आ रही
आ
क्या
रही है ना आवाज?
मेरे को आ रही है
आ रही है। हाँ मुझे भी आ रही है। 99 पे है बटलर। आ गया तू? अरे इनवाइट पे तो बोलेगा लाल वाला और तो बटन तो बस।
कर रहा हूँ हाँ मैं एक बार ना वो शिफ्ट कर रहा हूँ फीफा वाला ऊपर करके ना इसकी वाली नीचे कर रहा हूँ स्ट्रीम
बटलर चौथी शो है पांचवी शो है इसकी बटलर की।
ऐसे ही है कोई चौथी पांचवी में से ही कोई
भाई इसकी 800 से ऊपर रन हो गए इस सीजन में बटलर के।
आजा
पेज
आई रिक्वेस्ट जीत गए छक्का मार दिया इसने
बटलर ने बटलर ने कोहली की बराबरी
मुझे लग रहा है राजस्थान जीत जाएगा फाइनल भी जीत जाएगा राजस्थान
देखते हैं कड़क मुकाबला होगा लेकिन जो भी
क्या रनों में कोहली की बराबरी कर ली इसने वो 900 वाले
900 वाले तो नहीं 5 सेंचुरी की।
अच्छा सेंचुरी की कर ली होगी कोहली की वरना कोहली के वो एक आईपीएल सीजन में हाईएस्ट वाले 931 उसी के है ना
रियल चल चल
एक मिनट थोड़ा ना थोड़ा इधर उधर घुमाइयो मेरे को एक चीज़ ठीक करनी है बस अब जल्दी आ दे
आ गया क्या?
आ गया अब
अबे तुझे पता है
क्या?
राइट स्टिक से भी बंदे चेंज होते हैं।
हाँ पता है, उससे तू चूज कर सकता है कौन से वाले को जाना है।
हाँ कहाँ मारू बता।
दे दे किसी को भी, एक्स से मारियो
एक्स से ही मारा है।
मगर साइड में मारना था थोड़ा सा ना, वरना बीच में उनके बंदे मिल जाते हैं। अरे क्या भाई, क्या ये क्या चल रहा है?
क्या पता भाई।
डिफेंडर्स को मत खिला, पीछे डिफेंड खत्म हो गया देख। अरे मेरे से ही निकाल दिया। डाल आगे, अभी नहीं काट दे। अरे चल ठीक है।
साइड में।
अरे किसको दे रहा है ये इससे यार, क्या चूतिया बंदा।
यहाँ दे।
अरे बच गया ना, मुझे लगा गया अंदर।
टिप करा था इसने। अरे यार ये कहाँ ऑफ है। फंस गया।
निकाल ले डा। मार दे। अरे एक्स से उछाल भी सकता है, एक्स से मेरे पास आ सकते हैं। डाल। अरे इतना अकेला क्यों खेल रहा है?
दे यहाँ दे।
भगाता रहे। डाल दे, अबे बीच में डाल दे। तब डालना था यार, वो बंदा आगे निकल गया फिर।
अरे यार,
अरे रेड
कार्ड ही दे दिया।
अरे हम आगे जा सकते हैं तो वो भी
यहाँ दे।
ओए तू ऑफ था। अरे तो चल आगे डाल दे इसको, डाल डाल डाल, एक्स्ट्रा डाल दे चाहे, भगा भगा साहब को, रोक के चल, रोक के चल, उतना है इतना वहां पे नहीं करना चाहिए था। देख के, अरे कहाँ,
अरे
अरे अरे अरे निकल गई थी। आगे डाल, चल अभी हाँ अब, अरे अब फंसेगा, बच गया। अरे सारे प्लेयर नहीं बोला,
आ रही है बस, स्ट्रीम कर रहा है।
स्ट्रीम तो अभी भी चल रही है ना भाई।
क्या हुआ, केस अभी भी चल रहा है खत्म?
दोनों ने पिच कर दिया, अब बस जूरी का लंच चल रहा है, उसके बाद बस 10-15 मिनट की बातचीत के बाद रिजल्ट आ जाएगा। कुछ भी आ सकता है, देख मेरे को लग रहा है कुछ भी हो सकता है, इधर उधर कहीं का भी हो सकता है। पकड़े वो तभी बोला नहीं ना पूरा।
ये लाइव स्ट्रीम आपने चालू कर रखी है क्या, वो वाली भी, डेप वाली भी?
दोनों चालू है, मतलब दोनों डाल दिए, फीफा भी चल रहा है।
मुझे दिखता है ना,
वो वाली अभी दिख नहीं रही होगी तेरे को, क्योंकि वो जब फोकस में आ रहा है तभी दिखती है।
अरे यार साइबर पंप डिस्काउंट पे मिल रहा है मुझको, थोड़ा ले लूँ। और RDR2 भी, बट RDR2 बहुत पुराना हो।
अरे अरे फंसेगा, फंस गया।
साइबर पंप में ये मल्टीप्लेयर नहीं डाला है।
साइबर नहीं, मल्टीप्लेयर नहीं है।
फंस गया।
अबे
यहाँ पे
बीच में, अरे जाने ये इतनी दूर से कैसे जा रहे हैं, हम तो वो ना जाते हैं।
क्या ही पता। दबा दे भाई बटन।
मैंने तो दबाई रखा है भाई, ये फिर भी सारे दिखा रहा है। अरे यार
अरे यार
लेफ्ट लेफ्ट। अरे अरे
अरे यार बढ़िया बना के लाया था मैं।
रेड। बीच में ले ले, बीच में ले ले, कटेगा ये। लेफ्ट से ले चल, लेफ्ट से। बहुत बढ़िया पहुंच गया तू, घुमा ले, घुमा। अरे यार
मैं घुमाया था यार।
अरे
भाई कुणाल कहाँ है?
कुणाल भाई मचा के आया आज।
अभी आप उसे बोल दोगे तो कंफ्यूज हो जाएगा क्या बोलना।
अरे
बंदा गिरा दिया भाई।
वहीं डालूंगा बीच में।
यहाँ देते।
अरे गया। चल 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 भगा ले, लेके चल, फिर आगे जाके एक्स से डालियो पास। मैं भी भागता हूँ साथ में बीच में। अरे हेड क्या कर रहा है चूती, डायरेक्ट शॉट मारता है ना। अरे बढ़िया लग गया, चलो। उस बंदे को डायरेक्ट वॉली लेनी चाहिए थी जो मेरे वाला था ना।
तो भाई अब ले नहीं तो मैं क्या करूँ?
तेरे को थोड़ा ना कुछ कह रहा
वो
हूँ,
तो,
कुछ कर।
अरे लेफ्ट ट्रिगर और लेफ्ट बटन को लेके तब शायद वॉली लेता है।
अच्छा चल 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 डाल। आगे लेफ्ट से लेफ्ट चला गया।
वहां सेंटर
बीच में आजा, बीच में आजा, मार दे। अरे क्या पेनल्टी,
बंदा गिरा दिया।
पेनल्टी।
हाँ
बढ़िया।
मार।
ए भगवान कहाँ। अरे यार,
अरे भाई आ गया जा, आ गया, बुला रहा हूँ।
अच्छा ये तेरे को ही देगा, तेरे पास ही। अच्छा चल इधर आ गया। क्या हुआ? तेरे को दे
अपने
दिया,
बंदे
अपने
को दे
बंदे पे खेल लो।
भाई कैसा निकाल गया, अटक गया भाई गेम। अटका था ना तेरा
बीच में थोड़ा सा। करता हूँ।
क्या खेलना है अभी?
बताओ आ रहा है।
एक लो।
तू एक सीजन खेल ले, फिर मैं और अजोमी एक मैच कर लेते हैं।
ठीक है
फिर आरएल चलते हैं।
तब तक कुणाल भी आ जाता है। कर देना यार।
कर रहा हूँ, 1 मिनट। अजोमी तेरे को ऑनलाइन नहीं दिखा रहा।
आ रहा है 8 देखना अब दिखा।
1 मिनट।
अरे ये सर्वर नहीं मिल रहा कुणाल, भेजो।
भेज दी।
हेलो।
यस ब्रो। अरे रुक जा कुणाल, तू गया तो नहीं ना गेम में?
ना 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 ना।
राइडर तो नहीं गया? तो तुम दोनों साथ में आ जाओ ना, फिर एक खेल लो अपना।
हाँ तो वही तो, तभी तो इसको मैसेज कर
अच्छा,
बोल रहा है जल्दी।
अच्छा सही है।
अरे एक बात बताओ, ये तुमने ये नया सर्वर क्यों बनाया?
ये भाई चैनल यूट्यूब का है ना, स्ट्रीमिंग का सर्वर।
अरे एक बिन बार भी तो था, उसी को रिसाइकिल कर दो।
वो तो अच्छा हाँ वो भी था, वो दूसरे का है। ठीक
कौन
है।
से पैसे लग रहे हैं?
तो बना लिया।
कौन से पैसे लग रहे हैं?
पैसे नहीं लग रहे, मैं पूछ रहा था, मुझे लगा कि कुछ लड़ाई वगैरह हो गई नॉर्मल वाले दिखे नहीं।
लड़ाई करके मतलब सेम बंदे लड़ाई करके दूसरे सर्वर पे आ गए।
पता नहीं भाई,
उन्होंने वहां लड़ाई करी, सर्वर छोड़ा और फिर वो सेम वहां पे आ गए।
इस सर्वर के साथ बड़ी यादें जोड़िए।
ये देखो, पहले 2 सेकंड में येलो कार्ड कैसे लेते हैं।
कौन था ये? अजोमी ने?
नहीं।
अच्छा
अरे कितने तेज भगाया अभी
कुणाल।
भाई पीएचजी के प्लेयर भी तो सही भागते हैं।
हाँ बहुत तेज भागते हैं। फिर गिरा रहे थे पीछे।
निकाल निकाल लेफ्ट से, बढ़िया। अच्छा चल 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 आगे, भगा ले। मैं घुसता हूँ इधर से।
अरे कर दो सेंटर खाली है अभी।
अरे कहाँ दे दिया?
अबे यार पास करने के लिए भी सामने।
2 मिनट दियो बस, खुल रहा
है।
है।
ओ भाई उड़ा दिया बंदा उड़ा दिया। वो फाउल भी नहीं दिया, मतलब येलो कार्ड वाला नहीं है।
एडवांटेज मिल गया ना, लेकिन बहुत ही बढ़िया निकाला।
अरे बच गया। नहीं, लेफ्ट में।
अबे यार लेफ्ट में तो बंदा ही फिर
राल छुट्टी ली थी फिर तूने आज?
अरे नहीं यार,
सेकंड हाफ में गया था ना।
राल
सेकंड हाफ में गया था।
बोल के अच्छा अब तो रिजाइन कर दिया, क्या ही बोलेंगे।
हाँ मतलब लाइक काम भी कम ही है तो चला गया।
नहीं वैसे कुणाल क्या हाफ डे लिया था या फिर नहीं?
कुछ नहीं ली। आई जस्ट सेड
फिर सही करा, क्योंकि वो कहते हैं ये नोटिस पे होते हैं ना, तो नोटिस पीरियड बढ़ाने के चक्कर में कंपनीज करती हैं फिर कि आपका 1 दिन का बढ़ा देंगे नोटिस पीरियड, इसके चक्कर में बताना मत।
मैं कभी नहीं बता रहा हॉलिडे तो इट विल ऑलवेज बी लाइक कि गड़बड़ है। तो आज ना मैं जो है शाम को पेरेंट्स के साथ भी था, ठीक है? तो याद है हम लोग बनारस वाला स्टॉल देखा जब एरोसिटी गए, ठीक है? तो यहाँ पे भी एक है, तो वो मुझे दिखा रहे चलो बनारसी पान देख, ठीक है? पहले तो प्राइस देख के यही तो
वो बनारसी
ठीक है। हाँ वो बनारसी है ही नहीं, बोले लोग तो कैलकाटा वाला पान है, इतने बड़े बड़े उसने बैठ बजा दी दुकान। वो बोल रहा बेचारा, मैं तो क्या खोलती यार तो
भगा दे, देख के भगाइए मगर। अरे नहीं अरे
सही ओरिजिनल
मार दे शॉट।
अरे आपको
गया कैसे नहीं, मुझे भी लगा गया यार, ये जाना चाहिए।
भाई नकुल की आवाज
के उससे कनेक्ट नहीं हो रहा
अभी जैसे। अरे निकली क्यों नहीं?
भाई ये बैठ गया, ये क्या सर्वर बैठ गया?
अरे
नहीं कनेक्ट हो रहा।
मुझे तो लग रहा है नवीन का इंटरनेट है, उसकी भी आवाज कट रही है। मेरा तो फीफा ही नहीं स्टार्ट हो रहा। हाँ आवाज तेरी कटी थी बीच में, बट ठीक है।
मुझे दे दी, मुझे पता ही नहीं चला, इतने पास था मैं
इतनी देर से प्ले क्लिक कर रहा हूँ, खुल ही नहीं रहा।
मार दे। अरे
आ गया, चलो
सेव कर लिया यार। क्या कुणाल क्या कह रहे थे ऐसे पान के लिए?
पापा बोलते हैं कि ये पान तो बनारसी है ही नहीं, ठीक है? ये तो कैलकटिया पान है, इतने गंदे वक्ते यूज कर रहे हो ये वो। तो कह रहा भैया हमें पता है, बट अब हम यहाँ तो खाली काम करते हैं। मैं खुद भी आज तो बड़ा फनी एक्सचेंज हुआ 5 मिनट तक। वो पूछने लग गए पापा सैंपल वगैरह देखो, फिर उन्होंने पत्ते का साइज देखा।
कन्वर्सेशन फनी।
ये आज की बात कर रहे हो? वही
हाँ आज
नहीं मतलब उस पे ही।
हाँ
चांदनी
चौक नहीं, ये तो ये आज रात में
भगा लेफ्ट ले, बंदे को लेफ्ट लेके जा।
कनेक्टिंग टू ये हाँ एक्सेप्ट कर रहा हूँ, रुक जा।
हो गया अरे बढ़िया।
अच्छा मेरे ऊपर नहीं लगा, नहीं तो वो हो जाता ऑप्शन।
भाई ये पंदरों की तरह, भाई ये पंदरों की तरह क्यों कर रहे हो?
क्या और कैसे करेंगे भाई, यही खुशी होती है भाई, इसी के लिए तो खेलते हैं हम। मुश्किल से तो मिलती है हमें।
5वां बंदा कौन है डिस्कॉर्ड पे?
भाई डर गया इतना बंदा, वो उसने डायरेक्ट पॉज कर दिया भाई।
डिस्कॉर्ड पे 5वां बंदा कौन है?
5वां बंदा
इनवाइट भेजा है कुणाल तो
आया नहीं।
इस नकुल ने उस पे डिस्कॉर्ड पे डाल दिया ना।
आ गया अब
कुणाल YouTube पे डाल दिया इसने लिंक डिस्कॉर्ड का।
अच्छा ओ ये जो भी चैनल देखे कोई भी आ सकता। समझ गया, यानी कि रैंडम
कम्युनिटी टाइप होगी ना फिर अपनी।
हाँ समझ गया। ठीक है, यानी कि हम नहीं जानते थे कि आउटसाइडर है अभी। ठीक है,
देख के पास करना था वहाँ।
पास कर दिया था, दबा दिया था मैंने बटन वो, लेकिन सामने फंस गया इतना।
अरे यार डिफेंडर नहीं बचे, गिरा दे कोई से यार।
मैं अपने ही बंदे को गिरा
निकाल दिया। अरे नहीं बच गए।
दे दिया इसने।
डाल दे बहुत ही सही। बंदा बीच में ले जा अपना। ये ले आएगी, शूट मार रहे।
क्या सामने खड़ा हो गया था वो वहीं जहाँ।
गिरा एक साथ देखो। चल भारी मारते
ना। कहाँ गया भाई?
मैं यही हूँ।
ये यहीं पे है ना? हाँ आई थी ना रिक्वेस्ट।
हाँ आ तो गया, अंदर आ गया। वेटिंग फॉर फ्रेंड दिखा रहा हूँ।
तो सर्चिंग फॉर मैच दिखा रहा होगा देख साइड में।
हाँ।
अरे यार किसको दे रहा है?
अबे यार छूट, इतना भागते नहीं, छूट ही जाती है।
दिव्यांश की सेल्फ सेंसरशिप इन एक्शन।
यार ये तो ये बोल रहा था छूट ही गई, तुम्हें क्या सुनाई देता रहा?
अरे
अरे नहीं, बढ़िया।
काली स्क्रीन तेरी भी आ रखी है क्या डार्क राइडर? हाँ ठीक है।
अरे
कहाँ जा रही है
ये गेम इतना लैग कर रहा है।
चैन वाला नहीं होता लोड।
हाँ 1 सेकंड, मैंने चार्जर नहीं लगाया ना तभी तो। हाँ रुक जा, चार्जर भी नहीं लगाया।
क्या का?
बिल्कुल हाफ लेन की 1-1 तो रहा है। अगले उसमें 4-1 भी हो सकता है।
सही है। बस वो 4 हमारे हो भगवान।
You lost connection to your
ये वैसे का नेट गया है। डार्क
राइडर में इंटरनेट गया।
अभी तेरा लैग मार।
अरे ऑफ कहाँ दे दिया?
अरे मुझे क्या पता था, मैंने तो तेज मारा था सबसे आगे वाले बंदे के पास जाए, इतना आगे तो बंदा यही नहीं पता था।
अरे कहाँ लेफ्ट वाले को देना था।
यही मैं बोल रहा हूँ, बार छूट जाती है बॉल इसमें।
हेलो
हाँ आवाज आ रही है।
आ रही है। मेरे नेट में शायद कुछ इशू आ रहा है।
वो पता लग गया।
डिस्कनेक्ट कर रहा था मैं इसलिए।
अरे कहाँ दे रहा है यार, सामने वाले को
डिस्कनेक्ट।
अरे गिर गया उसको।
अरे यार उठ तो जा, उठते भी
नहीं वो नहीं, दूसरा बंदा गिरा था और बॉल इसने छोड़ दी।
निकल गई वो भाई के, निकालिए बस।
अब सुना दो।
नहीं अच्छा भागो
बंदा ले जा। तू ना अपना बंदा मतलब इससे डिस्ट्रैक्ट करके मेरे से वहां पे लेके जा सकता है, मतलब इससे ओए फंस गई। डाल दे बीच में। अब नहीं। अरे यार
सामने खड़ा था बंदा।
लेफ्ट से चलते हैं। घुसा। अरे क्लोज।
एक्सेप्टेड। चलो
यार ये
होल्ड कर। चल ठीक है भाई, बाहर से आता हूँ। ये ले अंदर आएगी। एक्सेट डाल दियो। मारना।
अरे
क्या हुआ? ऑफ
आया मुझे लगा पेनल्टी।
अरे तू कहाँ चला गया? डिफेंडर ले गया पूरा। बच गए।
वो चेंज करो, बंदा थक गया अपने।
कर दिया।
हो जा भाई सर्च।
उठा ले उठा ले। मेसी मेसी मेसी।
अरे यार भागा नहीं बंदा।
उतना थोड़ी है।
पास डालेगा पकड़
नो
ले। अबे यार कैसा वो था, ये गोलकीपर आगे पकड़ना था इसको आके।
यार नो ओपोनेंट ये क्या मतलब है?
अरे वैसे मैंने समय का शो का चेक कर रहा था, वो तो फुली बुक दिखा रहा है दिल्ली का।
और क्या होगा भाई?
दिल्ली का भी गुड़गांव वाला भी दोनों।
अरे
जाने
भाई
जल्दी।
भाई रेड दे
आगे
डायरेक्ट ही लो यहाँ से, तो कोई तभी फायदा है।
आया नहीं है कुणाल, अभी तो लगाया है, पिछली बार लगाया था तो आया, मिला ही नहीं कोई। हाँ तो गया।
चलो बढ़िया।
अरे
तो तू खेल रहा है? अच्छा नहीं खेल रहा।
नहीं तो ही खेल रहा है भाई।
ये काली स्क्रीन कैसे हो जाती, फिर डिस्कनेक्ट हुआ कोई?
नहीं डिस्कनेक्ट नहीं होता, लोड होता है पेज। तू है ए से पास दे मेरे को, मेरी साइड करके।
ठीक है हम ब्लू वाले हैं ना, चलो ठीक है।
हाँ तू ब्लू है, मैं रेड हूँ।
रोक ले।
और
नहीं,
ऑल ओवर हम ब्लू ही हैं।
हाँ बस
ए से पास दे, बहुत सही।
करो
अबे यार
चेंज कर लेना।
कर लिया।
अरे यार
तेरे को अरे अरे बचा दिया, डिफेंडर ने बचा दिया।
पास दे।
आगे बुला लो, आगे आना ऐसे कर।
अरे
कुणाल यहाँ दे यहाँ दे यहाँ दे।
अरे काट गया।
कोई नहीं कोई बात नहीं।
भी अरे
बटन दबाने से पहले तो निकल ही जाती है बॉल। क्लिक करो।
ले जा। अरे
अरे नहीं
पेनल्टी होगी।
नहीं उसको बोला है।
सही
देख के बंदा है।
मार 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 मार।
पेनल्टी
एक्स से मार।
बोला था क्योंकि मैंने एक्स दबाया।
अरे भाई
मैंने
तेरे राइट में, तेरे राइट में
भाई क्या हो गया?
कोई दिक्कत नहीं, छोड़।
गोल।
हम रोज हारते हैं।
मजा आ गया।
सही पास निकल गया तब।
बहुत सही।
खाली में देख, खाली में देख।
अबे देख, जब हम बंदे लेके जा रहे होते हैं ना उनकी साइड, तो उनके बंदे ना हमारे एक बंदे के साथ चल रहे होते हैं। जैसे अगर मैं जा रहा हूँ और मैं एक बंदा तो साइड अपने साथ लेके चले गया ना, तो तेरे लिए स्पेस बन जाता है। तो बस वही उनके बंदे डाइवर्ट करवाने हैं अपने को ना।
मार।
अरे
वापस दे वापस दे।
मेसी अभी नहीं भगाता रहे। चल सही है।
एक्स से मार। वानी
किधर?
इधर जहाँ मैं खड़ा हूँ यहाँ।
सांप खड़ा था।
अरे भाई
ज्यादा ही दूर से दिखेंगे।
बहुत ज्यादा।
बहुत ही बढ़िया गिरा, बहुत बढ़िया।
अभी तो बोला।
अरे
अब दे दिया। कोई नहीं, येलो कार्ड वाले मैं सारे रिप्लेस कर रहा हूँ। दे देना दे।
वो तो तब होगा ना जब वो कॉल आएगा। कॉल
तो हाँ, वो कॉल सबसे पहले येलो कार्ड वालों की आती है ना। अच्छा। तो आते ही मैं रिप्लेस मार देता हूँ।
चल चल चल, बहुत सही बहुत सही बहुत सही। यहाँ दे यहाँ दे यहाँ दे, पास दे। कहाँ लेके जा रहा है? पीछे लेके जा रहा है।
अरे पकड़
गोल भाई,
क्या
इक्वलाइजर
क्या
गिरा दिया आपने
यार।
भाई, इक्वलाइजर
अरे
कर
नहीं,
दिया।
पेनल्टी नहीं है कम से कम।
फिर तो सही गिरा है। पीछे मतलब उसके बंदे सारे पीछे आ जाते हैं। आगे चल आगे चल आगे चल।
भाई बंदा गिरा दिया यार।
मैसी एकदम राइट में, मैसी अभी नहीं। अरे
यार
इतना आगे भाग गया, खुद ही भाग गया, मैं तो लेके भी नहीं
बंदे
गया
के पास, बंदे के पास जाके जिसके पास बॉल हो ना, बी दबाया कर। अरे मैं कह रहा हूँ, अगर ओपोनेंट के पास है ना, उसके पास जाके बी दबाया कर, तो उससे फिर छीनना शुरू करता है बंदा अपना। ए से पास दे मेरे को, आगे दे।
क्या हुआ? और खत्म हो गया मैच, ड्रॉ कर दिया।
अरे भाई कम से कम टाई तो करा है।
बड़े दिन बाद टाई भी बहुत बड़े दिन बाद हुआ है। बढ़िया खेला।
अरे नहीं, एक्स 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 मत दबा। कुणाल सुनाई दे रहा है? हेलो
चलो अब वो खेलना है ना,
इनका मैच चल रहा है ना अभी।
कुणाल,
अरे तो फिर हम तो आ जाते हैं। अरे हम खेल लेते हैं ना,
एक मैच और कर लेते हैं, इतना फिर ड्रॉप कर देंगे अगर हार रहे होंगे तो।
चलो करो फिर लगाओ।
तुम्हारा कितना टाइम हुआ अभी? हाफ टाइम हो गया?
नहीं
हुआ ना, ठीक है।
आप लगाओ।
तू रेडी कर ले, तूने रेडी
अरे मैंने थोड़ा सा बैक दबा शूट कर दिया था, एक बार वो फिर से भेजनी पड़ेगी आपको।
अच्छा
कुणाल
कुछ बोल ही नहीं रहा
यार, बोल ही नहीं रहा है।
खेल रहा है, गेम में खेल रहा है।
हाँ, गेम में तो हिलता दिख रहा है।
कुछ होगा,
क्या पता।
मैन वर्सेस बी का ट्रेलर देखा था जो मैंने कल भेजा था?
हाँ भाई बढ़िया।
इसकी ये ऐसी मूवीज बढ़िया रहती हैं सारी। एटकिंसन की।
कुणाल पास दे, लेफ्ट साइड। चल चल आगे चल। अरे यार, बहुत ही बढ़िया। चल आगे चल आगे चल।
ये क्या हुआ, गेम बंद हो गया?
हैं? हाँ तेरा स्टॉप प्लेइंग आ गया और मेरे को भी बाहर निकाल दिया।
आपका भी स्टॉप प्लेइंग आ गया मेरे उसमें तो।
दे दे दे, पास दे पास दे।
पता नहीं क्या
क्या बात दोनों के साथ।
चल फिर आर खोलेंगे सीधा अब।
हाँ अब तो बंद ही कर दिया गेम नहीं।
अरे यार, कुणाल भाई किधर है? अच्छा तो फिर ठीक है, चल रख रहा है।
ऑन भी नहीं कर सकता मैं गेम जब तक।
हाँ ये भी बात है। किया कैसे इसने?
पहले कर लिया होगा ना गेम स्टार्ट होने
नहीं।
से पहले। कहाँ भी काफी देर से नहीं बोल रहा है।
बढ़िया खेल रहा वैसे कुणाल।
वैसे साइबर पंक 1100 रुपये की पड़ रही है का अभी खेल की। वही सोच रहा हूँ, लेकिन 1100 से कम हो सकती है क्या अभी? उसमें ऑनलाइन नहीं है, उसमें वो ऑनलाइन होता तो मैं ले भी लेता। लेकिन उसकी साइबर पंक की स्टोरी लाइन तो काफी अच्छा वो बोल रहे हैं।
पास दे। अरे यार अरे ऑफ साइड बहुत दे आगे पास दे। सेमी खुद को ही पास दे दिया, बहुत बढ़िया। अरे यार
आ गया तू?
लग रहा है। आज मेरे को नींद आ रही है, इतने दिनों से मैं रोज सो रहा था। आज सोचा सोने की जगह काम कर लेता हूँ। आज
अरे
आज मैं सोया नहीं ऑफिस के टाइम पे ज़्यादा।
सही।
सोचा थोड़ा सा काम पूरा कर लेता हूँ, मतलब आगे का एक्स्ट्रा वाला।
मैं तो कल ऑफिस गया था, अपना काफी काम कल के आ गया, फिर मैंने आज एकदम रेस्ट
वही
मारा।
मैं एक्स्ट्रा वाला ही बोल रहा हूँ, मतलब ऐसा डेडलाइन वाला काम तो पहले ही हो रखे होते हैं, तो थोड़ा सा और खत्म कर लेंगे आज। फ्राइडे था, खाली रहता है दिन में, मीटिंग्स वगैरह
अरे
कम
यार
होती
गोल
हैं।
खा गए, हट यार, हट। कुणाल पास दे।
कोई नकुल, कोई और सीरीज या मूवी वगैरह कोई ढंग की आई है अभी?
अभी इस कल आज आनी थी काफी सारी, 27 फ्राइडे है ना आज। हाँ आज काफी सारी रिलीज होनी थी।
चल
बॉयज भी तो शायद आज ही आना था 27 में को।
नेक्स्ट वीक आ रहा है फ्राइडे।
अच्छा
नहीं, नेक्स्ट वीक फ्राइडे नहीं, मंडे को आ रहा है। सॉरी, सैटरडे से संडे में आना है। 3 दिन का बस।
सेंटर।
अरे यार बंदा टूट गया।
बढ़िया। बहुत बढ़िया, भाग। बहुत ही सही।
मारो सीधा। अबे यार डायरेक्शन बन गया था। मैं पास देता तो
बहुत ही सही खुला।
मैंने सीधे ही मारी थी।
मेरे सही था। मैं तो बैठा इसलिए था कि अगर किसी से मिस होता है तो मैं मार दूंगा, वरना ट्राई कर लेगा।
बढ़िया बनाओ, मैंने ठोक दिया।
ये ले। अरे
मैंने उससे ठोक के पड़वाया।
बढ़िया। मैं सोचा मेरा कैसे आ गया।
क्या है यार, वहां बंदे खड़े हुए थे भाई, वहां नहीं देना था।
अरे बहुत बढ़िया। ये वंश मेरे से 10 किलोमीटर दूर कहीं आया हुआ था येलो लाइन पे आज। वो मेरे से पूछता कि अपनी लोकेशन भेज दियो, और वो बोलता कि मैं तेरे घर के पास आया हूँ। 10 किलोमीटर दूर था मेरे से, और उसे लगता पूरे येलो लाइन पे मैं रहता हूँ। मुझे लगा आया हो सकता है, यहाँ पे फंक्शन होते रहते हैं DRDO कॉम्प्लेक्स में, किसी का कोई रिश्तेदार वगैरह दोस्त वगैरह का वो निकले।
अरे कहाँ, कोई नहीं।
अरे बहुत ही इनका एक बंदा गया क्या? दूसरे बंदे के भी कुछ खास पॉइंट तो
पास से आगे
2 मिनट में भी।
क्रॉस दे।
ये भी
नहीं, गलत बहुत ही सही।
कितना टाइम बचा है तुम्हारा?
स्कोर क्या चल रहा है? अरे तुमने वो वाला मीम देखा था जिसमें एम्बर ऐसा किसी ने एडिट करके बनाया कि जॉनी डेप बोलने ही नहीं दे
In other
रहा
words,
उसको।
she has to prove that her abuse claims are not a
स्टैंड पे
hoax.
जब वो है
But as we've seen, the evidence is
वो
overwhelming
वाला
that Ms.
देखा है
Hood's claims
तुमने,
to
एडिट करके
abuse
बनाया
are
उसने।
false.
नहीं।
We should also spend a bit of time
जब
talking
भी
about
बोलती है तो
actual malice.
ठीक देता
It
है
is Ms.
या
Heard's burden
शेर
to
के आवाज
prove
निकालते
that
रहता है।
Mr. Waldman's statements were made with actual malice. And
अच्छा
actual malice means
नहीं
knowledge
चल
that
रहा
the statements were false or
कुणाल कहाँ दिया है यार पास?
that's an important word, reckless disregard for the truth.
बढ़िया, दे पास दे।
But here, there is clear evidence that Mr.
कोई
Waldman
नहीं,
genuinely
बढ़िया
believed
था।
that
कुणाल
Ms.
हो
Heard
सकता
had
है
committed a
साथ
hoax.
कॉल पे दिया।
You watched him
क्या
give
पता।
the testimony by deposition in this case.
तभी
He
मैं
testified about the evidence he found persuasive,
Maybe
the numerous witnesses and the sworn depositions of
क्विट कर
police
ले
officers
कुणाल।
who went to the penthouses that night and again saw no injuries. There is no evidence.
अरे नहीं, बचा ले
None. That Mr. Waldman acted with actual malice. He believed Mr. Depp. He believed the record. It's also important to understand that because Mr. Waldman's statements were not made by Mr. Depp, Ms. Heard needs to prove that Mr. Waldman was acting as Mr. Depp's agent. And within the scope of that agency, within the scope of the agency's
क्या स्कोर रहा तुम्हारा?
when he made the
3-1।
Mr.
तुम्हारे
Waldman
तीन
is a
ठीक है।
नहीं
Ms. Heard
उसके
has not
भाई,
presented evidence that making those
लेकिन फिर
statements
भी
is part of
बढ़िया
Mr.
खेला भाई कुणाल,
Waldman's
बिल्कुल
responsibilities
सही
as a
निकल
Mr.
रहा था।
Depp's lawyer. There's nothing in the record. Ms. Heard is also claiming to be suffering from PTSD and claims that she has something to do with Mr. Waldman's statements. Ms. Heard wants you to believe that she suffers from PTSD because Mr. Depp purportedly abused her. But as usual, Ms. Heard is not telling the truth. As you heard from Dr. Shannon Curry, Ms. Heard does not have PTSD. She does not act like a person with PTSD.
अरे
Ms. Heard is an actress in a major film. Involved
अरे
in some related
एक मंथ का नाइट्रो डिस्कॉर्ड नाइट्रो
Dr.
फ्री
Curry
मिल।
also found that Ms. Heard attempted to grossly exaggerate the symptoms during testing, which is a sign of malingering.
एक मंथ का डिस्कॉर्ड नाइट्रो फ्री मिल रहा है,
of Ms.
सही हो
Heard's
सकता है वो
Ms.
नकुल
Heard
का।
hired Dr. Don Hughes to help her with this narrative.
हाँ
Dr.
लेकिन ये
Hughes did not
कम्युनिटी नहीं
catch
बनी।
Ms. Heard's exaggeration during testing because Dr. Hughes used an
जब
improper malingering
इतनी बनेगी तो ले लेंगे जब जरूरत होगी।
और क्या?
one that is meant to identify and examine the attempt to fake a severe mental illness or psychosis, not PTSD. Dr. Hughes diagnosed Ms. Heard with PTSD without administering the gold standard diagnostic test used for PTSD. She diagnosed her, speaking of that, she diagnosed her with PTSD before administering the test she admitted was the gold standard.
अरे बहुत अरे
2 years after diagnosing her with PTSD,
अरे कहाँ से बचा दिया इसने?
shortly after Dr. Curry administered the gold standard diagnosis
Center.
test in her evaluation,
मैं वहीं
before
खड़ा
it was
था
disclosed, Dr. Hughes decided to administer
कितना बचा है तुम्हारा?
fine.
2.5 मिनट
Nevertheless, even after Dr. Hughes used the proper test, there were a number
बता
of
देना।
deficiencies in her administration
अरे
including her failure to even follow the instructions that rendered her diagnosis unreliable. Ms. Heard's claims of monetary damages related to
मार दे अरे
यार जल्दी
Ms. Heard speculates wildly that she had somehow been damaged by Mr. Walden's statement.
अरे फिर रह
But
गया
in reality, Ms. Heard has not shown any
अरे
damage at all that was because of or by Mr. Walden's statement.
बढ़िया अरे फिर रुक गया
There is evidence of a mountain of negative press coverage about Ms. Heard.
यार फोड़ के मारा था ये तो गोल जाना चाहिए
Bed, cutting off his fingers and putting out a cigarette on his face. But none of that has
बढ़िया फोड़ा
anything to do
फिर सीधे जा रहा था गोल
सेंटर
and Ms. Heard has presented no evidence
अरे
of any film or other project that she has lost
सेंटर
मैं पीछे आ गया यार
because of this decision.
ऐसे ही रोक देंगे
In fact, we heard from Warner Brothers president Walter
अरे
who explained that Ms. Heard suffered no loss, none, no loss of compensation or other adverse
Center.
effects on her major film, Aquaman 2. Heard
चलो
it straight from him.
मेरे को लगा मैंने
Ms. Heard's expert, Catherine Arnold, testified.
मैंने किसी को तो मारा
Statements
शायद
from Mr. Walden, Ms. Heard would be a much more
अरे
successful
लगा तो ऐसे जैसे तू नहीं मारा है
Ms. Arnold compares
मुझे भी
Ms.
कुछ
Heard
वही
to
लगा मैं
actress
नहीं मारा
Jason
इतना अच्छे से गिर के सीधे बॉल के
Chris Pine, Gal Gadot, and Zendaya. But as Richard Marks,
मैं बोलता तो हूँ इस गेम की दुश्मनी तो है ही नहीं इससे
does deals in Hollywood. And Doug Vanya both testified that these actors are simply not comparable to Ms. Heard. After all, Jason Momoa, he was Aquaman. Chris Pine, he was Captain Kirk. Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. Zendaya, she's been acting since she was 13 years old.
ऐसे रेड डेड भी काफी सही गेम है उसका भी ऑनलाइन वाला भी है शायद
Further,
रेड
the
डेड
team force of these
Red Dead
actors are not at
Redemption.
all comparable to Ms. Heard's.
वाइल्ड वगैरह
As
का
Mr. Vanya testified, Ms. Heard's rating was less compared to these actors, and all of Ms. Heard's Q-scores ratings were less favorable than the average of all performers. As we heard from Michael Simmons, because Ms. Arnold relied on
कितना
the
बार क्या
salary
उसको
of
मतलब गेम
comparable actors,
लेके तो वो
calculating Ms. Heard's
रिव्यू उसके लेकिन
Ms. Heard's
ऑनलाइन कितना
claim
अच्छा है वो नहीं पता
makes no sense. There's no connection. Further,
आ गया
the
राइडर आ गया
for Ms. Heard's damages claim is that there's no connection to the Waldman statements, to Mr. Waldman's statements. Even if you find damage
कर
to
दिया
her
मैंने
career, you have to
एक्सेप्ट नहीं
connect
करना
it to the defamatory statements.
कर रहा हूँ
There is no connection. Mr. Banya
इसमें
testified that all
सेलेक्ट
the
दबाना
negative
पड़ता
tweets
होगा तब
that
पॉज
Ms. Heard
करता
has
होगा
entered
गेम
into
को
evidence
है ना
have no causal connection to the statements underlying Ms. Heard's counterclaims. Specifically, Ms. Heard's expert, Mr. Ron Schell, presented a flawed methodology that included picking out hashtags at random, including Justice for Johnny Depp. What does that have to do with the Waldman statements? And counting accompanying tweets, even though it had nothing to do with Mr. Waldman. Ms. Heard's counterclaim is based on statements by Mr. Waldman, not Mr. Depp. Ms. Heard knows perfectly well that she hasn't suffered any
चाहिए अगर गेम में पॉइंट्स पड़े हैं उसको सेल करके
buried at the bottom
पैसे
of
में कन्वर्ट
articles in
करने
a
से
mere tablet, the Daily Mail.
जैसे CS:GO में है ना
And the statements are substantially true, since all they do really
यहाँ
is
पे
point out that Ms. Heard's abuse allegations
800 रुपए के
are
पॉइंट्स
false.
पड़े हैं
Ms. Heard's counsel argued that Ms. Heard did not write the title of the online version of the op-ed, which stated, "I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's
पॉइंट्स कौन सा
that
पड़े
has to
भाई
change. Does not
वॉशरूम हो
matter
गया
whether
इसकी
or not
करेंसी
Ms.
है
Heard wrote
1100
the title.
वो जो पड़ी
You
हुई
will
है
recall from the court's instructions this morning that what matters is whether Ms. Heard republished the defamatory
भाई अब भी मिडिल ईस्ट
That instruction states in part that you should find Ms. Heard republish
आपकी सबसे
this
बढ़िया है
article if she, quote,
But
transmitted the
तब मैं वहाँ
defamatory material with the goal of
बस
achieving a new
ले
audience.
तेरा बोलता ही
Stated
खराब
differently, republication occurs
बहुत ही
when the
बढ़िया
speaker has affirmatively, that's important, affirmatively reiterated the statement. Ms. Heard affirmatively reiterated the
अरे
statement
नखुन
she
नहीं चल रहा
posted on her Twitter.
तो रोक दिया मैंने अरे नहीं अपने कहाँ थे नकुल
बोला तो था वॉशरूम हो गया
This is the tweet Ms. Heard sent.
गेम तो लग गया
She retweeted the Washington Post tweet to a new audience, her own Twitter followers. And she affirmatively reiterated the statement by proudly declaring, "Today I published this op-ed in the Washington Post."
हाँ ठीक है भाई बीच बीच में हो जाती है ठीक है
With the title,
वो मतलब
she
आपका
said,
नेट खराब है
proudly, "Today I published this op-ed in the Washington Post." The title of the op-ed was prominently displayed in the tweet. That is enough for you, members of the jury, to find that Ms. Heard republished the title of the op-ed in a document statement as her own. She can and should be held liable and responsible for that statement.
बढ़िया
Ms. Heard tries to make something out of the fact that Mr. Waldman reported her to law enforcement in Los Angeles for perjury after her allegations of abuse were made against Mr. Depp. I'll submit to you that all this proves is that Mr. Waldman believes Ms. Heard has committed perjury.
अरे बढ़िया
Mr. Ronborn argued that the lack of supporting evidence in Ms. Heard's allegations of horrendous, constant abuse is somehow
बहुत ही बढ़िया
that it is shameful for you to consider the fact that she didn't document all the terrible injuries that she claims to have suffered. That is a twisted argument. First, you know, because you have seen and listened to Ms. Heard in action, that Ms. Heard is a woman who is documenting things throughout the relationship. And it is instructive that the things she chose to document had nothing to do with violence. She documented Mr. Depp's sleep. She documented lines of cocaine featuring prominently Mr. Depp's blown-out company, production company, United. Stage photographs. That's what she documented.
अरे नहीं
Mr. Rottenborn's entire argument is that Mr. Depp, a man, should be disbelieved because despite the fact that Ms. Heard
भाई क्या कर दिया ये
what we have put to you, the jury, is not that because Ms. Heard didn't take enough pictures to tell people about
अरे
it.
गया
What we have put to you is that given how brutal and constant the abuse Ms. Heard claims, she would have had serious
कह रहा आएंगे 12:30 तक
That's a fact. She would have had serious injuries
वो जाने के टाइम
that
पे
would have been
आएगा
observable in the pictures we looked at and by the witnesses we heard from, and would have required medical.
आएंगे
That's it.
टीम लेके आ रहा है क्या
Ms. Heard testified to injuries that multiple people didn't see. What you have in the end is Ms. Heard's story.
एक्टिंग दोनों की टीम में से ज़्यादा अच्छी है फिर भी कम पॉइंट्स
We are not
मैं कंट्रोलर से खेल रहा हूँ
told the world Mr. Depp was brutally abusive.
अब तक तो सीख
This is not about the world
नहीं
abused by Mr. Depp. We are here
रोज
to
थोड़ी
ensure
खेलता हूँ कंट्रोलर से मैं
that Mr. Depp was physically and
खेल
sexually
रहे हो वैसे रोज को क्या तब आराम से हाथ पैर रहेगा
saying in the op-ed. On May 22nd, exactly 6 years ago today,
लोग तभी हाथ बैठेगा अगर उसको फिर
Ms. Heard
ये
walked
यार
into court
कीबोर्ड और
to
उसको
mark on
खेल
her
पाओगे
face to tell the world that her husband was abusive. She renewed that falsehood in her op-ed, describing herself as a public figure representing.
अरे
छोड़ दिया
She
मैंने
published the op-ed, including the title, claiming that she spoke up against sexual violence. Everyone
यार इंडिया का ही सर्वर पे लगाओ हम तीन ही तो हैं
talking about
नॉर्मल गेम खेल
अरे इंडिया का लगाया था पहले आया ही नहीं कुछ
physical and sexual abuse. She was not alleged
आज तो फ्राइडे आज भी तीन है
psychological. She was alleged physical and sexual abuse. Ms. Heard cannot run away from her own allegations now. You have all heard the evidence of what she alleged against Mr. Depp in 2016. You have all heard her incredibly dramatic, over-the-top story of physical and sexual abuse. That story is a defamatory lie. Ms. Heard tried to argue that you only need to find that Mr. Depp might have touched Ms. Heard once in order to find her favor. Because that
अबे यार
the common sense should tell you
बंदा ठोका भी था यार
saw her.
नमित को ज़्यादा बोलना आता है हमेशा मुंबई आएगी अगले साल
She
सब
gave the
मान के
performance of her life, telling
यही
you
चलता
story
रहेगा
after
तो
story
आप भी के
of
साथ
abuse. And not just any abuse, but extravagant, over-the-top allegations of abuse that would be truly brutal, horrific, if true. You either believe all of it,
यहाँ
or
उड़ना
you believe
उसका
none
तो
of it. Either
ये भी
she's
कर दे
telling the truth,
बहुत ही
including in her most extreme allegations, or she's lying. Either she was raped by a bottle, or she's the sort of person who would get on the stand in this courtroom and lie to you and the world about being raped. And if she would lie about that, what wouldn't she lie about?
अरे कर
You
दो
can't
आपको
find
कैसे
that Mr. Depp hit her once. Either he hit her countless times, or you can't believe a single word that comes out of her mouth. And what is the actual meaning of Ms. Heard's op-ed? That's an important question. It's not that Mr. Depp said a nasty word to her once. It's not that Mr. Depp might have hit her once. It's that she is a representative
Center.
of domestic abuse. And by extension, Mr. Depp is a representative of abuse.
अरे मेरे अंदर से निकल गई क्या ये?
Ms. Heard has shown you a lot of
Over,
text messages from Mr. Depp with some very vivid language. As I told you at the start of this trial, Mr. Depp has a unique style and technique. He uses words I don't use. And you probably don't use either. But as you also heard during this trial, Mr. Depp writes in that way, in part because he modeled his writing on literary giants like Hunter S. Thompson. And he's got a dark sense of humor. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's who he is. And Mr. Depp owns text messages. He acknowledges that he said those things, and he said things that he shouldn't have. But using bad language and colorful humor does not mean that you are a violent abuser. And ironically, as much as Ms. Heard is trying to use Mr. Depp's words against him, it is Ms. Heard who repeatedly admitted to violence. In her own words. You've heard the tapes. You've heard her admit to violence. Ms. Heard can try to distract you with text messages showing that Mr. Depp uses bad language and has a dark sense of humor. But none of that, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, none of that is evidence of abuse. Hitting your husband is evidence of abuse. Mr. Ronborn talked about the burden of proof. Let's talk about that for a minute. Mr. Depp only has to show that it is more likely than not, that the statements in the op-ed are false. That it is more likely than not they have a defamatory implication. That it is more likely than not that Ms. Heard designed and intended the statements to refer to Mr. Depp. And the evidence on these points is clear. Ms. Heard made these allegations 6 years ago today, May 27, 2016. She went out of her way to make them public, tipping off TMZ. When she published the op-ed, she was reminding everyone in Hollywood and the world of her abuse claims. And those claims are a lie. Consider what the true purpose of the article. Mr. Ronborn said it was to promote legislative reform. But what was it actually? The evidence shows it was to promote Ms. Heard. It was timed to be released at the same time possible on December 21st, 2018. And it was timed to coincide with her announcement of her ambassadorship at the ACLU for women's rights. That's not a coincidence. It was designed that way. That was not a statement about this was about furnishing Ms. Heard's reputation at the expense of Mr. Depp. It was about Ms. Heard continuing to portray herself as a heroic survivor of abuse. And on the question of actual malice, that just means whether or not Ms. Heard knew the allegations were false. Ms. Heard knows perfectly well that she was She has direct knowledge of that. She was in that relationship. So actual malice is easily established.
अरे क्या कर
You may have noticed that no one showed up for Ms. Heard in this courtroom other than Mrs.
अरे
Every other witness who traveled to Virginia for her was able.
अरे गया
मार दिया मैंने मार दिया
वाह
मैंने मार
Close
दिया
friends don't show up. Mr. Rottenborn
नहीं
tried to
नकुल
discredit
निकल गया था
the
ना
other witnesses by suggesting they're all on Mr. Depp's payroll. So he doubled down.
वो बंदा हग रहा था तेरे साथ वाला
Everyone's
और तूने मार दिया
First of all, it's not even true to be wild.
कुछ भी नहीं कहता तो भी तो
And
कुछ भी
King
नहीं
isn't on his payroll. Melissa Stein, officer Melissa Stein isn't on his payroll. Morgan Tremaine isn't on his payroll.
अरे?
Officer Tyler Haddon.
भाई
क्या ये बॉल और अब तो पिंग
भाई इतना क्या है कि ये सीधी सीधी बॉले टच नहीं हो रही
Brandon Patterson. Morgan Knight.
और कंट्रोल
None
और
of those people on his payroll.
हम भी तो कंट्रोलर
इतना भी कंट्रोलर का वो नहीं है भाई कि बॉल सी
कर रहे हैं हम
On Mr. Depp.
सीधी बॉल थोड़ा मिस कर देते
Ms. Heard wants you to believe that all these people are lying. Let's talk about the Boston claim. Ms. Heard wants you to believe that the recording you heard is from the Boston claim.
मुझे पैर जाएगा
But that's quite telling. What did Ms. Heard capture of this supposed claim? Mr. Depp moaning in distress? That's what she chose to record. What sort of person would record something like that? What sort of person takes pictures of their husband or boyfriend or fiance who's struggling with sobriety, nodding off, with ice cream dripping down his leg, his hand in his pocket, or asleep on the ground? What sort of person does that?
सेंटर से मत जाओ
Definitely not someone who's crazy.
अभी ग्राउंडेड
Ms. Heard
क्या ही करता है यहाँ पे
told
मैं
the story of May 21.
क्या करता है साले साइड लेफ्ट में डाल देता
ये करंट ड्रॉप कर रहा है कोहली को करने के लिए मेरे हिसाब से तो फिर तो शर्मा को भी कर देना चाहिए ड्रॉप की जैसा खेला अरे भाई ये
No
कैसे
signs of property damage. And she told a story
जैसे
about
दोनों
how
ने